Okay, so we are going to get into color theory today in a big way. Can you start me a sign in, please? Thanks. Yeah, so we're going to start with this as sort of at the beginning. RGB and CMY, and in parentheses K. We'll talk about what that is and why that is. These are tri-stimulus descriptions of color. Do not let that word tri-stimulus flip you out. All that means is that when color scientists first started to try to get a handle on color, they looked at human eyes and how do human eyes work. And inside your eyeballs, you have two different kinds of cells that are receptive to different areas and different qualities of light. One is cones and one is rods. Now, the rods in your eyes are the part of your eyes that really account for your peripheral vision. It's also low light vision, and it's also motion. That's why you typically, a lot of what your peripheral vision is, if you've got good peripheral vision, you'll know a lot of it involves motion. You actually detect motion really well outside of your the detail focus part in the center of your vision. The other cells in your eyes are cones, and cones are primarily responsible for the central part of your vision, also for color and detail. And what they found was that there are three different sensitivities of color in your cones. So you have cones that are sensitive to red light, cones that are sensitive to green light, and cones that are sensitive to blue light. And so they sort of took that information and put that part together to begin the study, the scientific study anyway, of color. And so that's why we come up with RGB, and we'll talk about how that evolved from that original awareness, and also what CMYK is relative to this. So, but basically in that same sort of sense of how your eyeballs work, tri-stimulus simply means you have three different sort of pieces of information that inform you and describe color. So this is ultimately what they figured out. So if you go back to the three scientists, or the scientists who are actually trying to figure all this out, if you take a look at this illustration, basically what we have is a white screen right here on the left-hand side. There's a shelf that comes out from it. And then there's a masking screen right here with pretty much like a peephole. And our observer right here is able to see through the peephole. And this shelf that's coming out, the black shelf that's coming out from the left-hand side, whatever, isolates the lights that are on the top and the light that's actually on the bottom. So they put just a target color on the bottom, and you can see it's sort of like a purpley-ish kind of color, or lilac-y purplish kind of color. And then on the top, they have a red light, a green light, and a blue light. And the red light, green light, and blue light are all on rheostats, which means they can control the amount of red light, green light, and blue light. So the trick to this is, or the beginning of this experiment was that they had the observer looking at the target color on the bottom, that purplish color, and then his job was to actually use the rheostats to vary the amounts of red, green, and blue to see if he could achieve that color. And you can see now in this next slide, very subtle change in there, but yes, indeed, you can actually achieve that color. So the additive primaries, and that is what red, green, and blue are. So I think, Barb, we were talking last week about all of this, the color wheel that you built in art class, and you learned color theory, and it was basically you mixed red, green, and blue to do all sorts of pigment colors, right? So there's a lot of confusion about this in the beginning when you first start to study color. The truth of it is, because most of us, how many of you guys, 6th grade, 7th grade, 5th grade, whatever, made the color wheel and you mixed the colors and yeah, right? You got all that part, right? The problem with that is that they always would tell you that the primary colors, and there were red, blue, and yellow, right? Isn't that what the primary colors in pigment were? The truth of it is they are really cyan, magenta, and yellow. And that points out part of the problem that we have in this whole structure is that my red is not necessarily your red, my green is not necessarily your green, and my blue is not necessarily your blue, nor is my cyan necessarily yours. I mean, all of that, there's this sort of like ambiguous thing when you talk about color. We aim to eliminate that part. We're going to talk about color in very specific terms because that's the only way you can really structure a system that allows you to have color managed workflow. So my red's going to be the same as everybody's red in this room, and you're going to have the same red as millions of people all over, if not billions of people all over the world, as defined by math, basically. So anyway, the additive primaries. So in a primary, in this system, an additive primary system, it's red, green, and blue are the primaries. Cyan, magenta, and yellow are the secondaries. So if we take a look at this chart right here, or not the chart, but this illustration right here, you can see that I've got a patch, a circle. Now imagine this is light. This is not pigment. This is light. So imagine you've got a spotlight that's just got a blue light shining on this screen, another spotlight that's got green shining on the screen, and another spotlight that's got red shining on the screen. Where those two overlap, relatively speaking, you get the secondary color. So we start out with red, green, and blue. But the secondary colors are where green and blue actually mix together, you get cyan. Where green and red mix together, you get yellow. And where red and blue mix together, you get magenta. Where all three mix together, you get a neutral gray. If you take this to the maximum intensity, you get white. But you need to remember that white is a neutral gray, middle gray is a neutral gray, black is a neutral gray, all of those are neutral grays. That's what equal amounts of RGB will actually give you, is an equal gray. We'll talk about that in a second. You'll see it here. This is an emissive technology, so you need to think of monitors. You need to think of projectors. It's that kind of technology that functions with or uses an additive primary system. So it starts with black, and this is a perfect example of one right here. This is a monitor, starts with black. This monitor is turned off. Can this thing get any blacker? No, people think it can, but it can't. There's no way you can get anything darker. If you unplug your monitor, there's no way you can get it any blacker than that. So it starts out at 0, black. Then you start to add energy. This is where the term additive comes into this. You start to add energy. You start to then get color and tone. Does that make sense, everybody, what's going on here? All right. You add different amounts of RGB to achieve any color. Equal amounts, and this is an importantly huge takeaway here. Equal amounts of any RGB equals a neutral gray. Now, we use this when we white balance. This is the whole trick to doing some white balance. When you use the white balance tool in Photoshop or in Capture One or in Lightroom, what you're saying to that software is that whatever I click on, I want you to neutralize that out. And basically that just means by definition that you're going to make the RGB values all equal to each other. Make sense? And you can see it happen when we're in Photoshop. We'll actually look at a situation where we can color balance something, and you'll see you can get the RGB readouts right underneath the histogram in Photoshop. And when you click on something, no matter what color it is, even if it's wrong, you will actually, it'll do its best to get those colors, the RGB values of those colors to equal each other, and you will end up with a neutral gray. So white is equal to RGB at its maximum intensity. How black is black? Well, I've already told you guys this. This is how black is. You cannot get blacker than a screen that's actually turned off, or can you? I need everybody to look at this screen right now. Did that screen just get lighter? It sure did. And if I turned off all these lights, that screen would get darker. Right? Why? The whole room is reflecting in that thing, right? So, notes to take down. Watch that screen again. Did it just get darker? Of course it did. Considerably darker. So, in our color managed workflow, sorry, these other lights are going to take like an hour to turn back on. But in our color managed workflow, the first thing that you have to take into consideration, because we are building now the foundation of color managed workflow, your environment controls your black point. So when we are looking at a contrast scale, tonal scale of any image on screen, the darks are really impacted heavily by the environment that you are in. So the room next door where all the printers are, I've actually had locks put on all the lights so that nobody can turn them on. We've got those whiteboard screens that are trying to kill any of the light from the workspace area of coming in. All of that is in an effort to actually get the black point of those monitors at a standard, consistent rate, and also dark enough to actually equate to, or to be able to give you something similar when you actually do a print. How many of you guys, when you print, ultimately end up with prints that are consistently too light or too dark? Anybody? In all likelihood, what is happening is this is what's happens. This is just a generalization, but I see it happen all the time. You are working in an environment that is way too light, and in order to fix that, to be able to make your monitor look like something that you think it should look like, whatever, you crank the brightness of your monitor up way high. Now, the file that's inside of Photoshop is not changed at all. When you crank the monitor up, that's not the file. You're not changing the file. You're not changing its numbers, its values. All you're making is your monitor brighter. So when you do that, you end up with thinking you're looking at an image that is too light on the monitor, but it's not too light in the file. However, because it's too light in the monitor, you go and throw a curve on that, or you reprocess it to make it darker so that it looks good on your screen. But the truth of it is the problem was the screen, not the file. But now that you've made the file darker and you go to print it out, you end up with a really dark print. It is a classic. It is because you are actually working in a room that is way too light. So how dark should your room really be? Well, and if you look at the resources in our website for this week, it's either this week's resources or last week's resources. It'll actually talk about how you can use a light meter to calibrate a room to be retouching in. So you can check out a light meter from the photo studio or from the media center downstairs and actually meter it. The calculation becomes a little tricky because the whole paper that talks about this stuff, whatever, gives you values in lux, and most of us don't deal in lux. But nonetheless, the rule of thumb, if you're not going to go quite that insane or quite that anal about it all, is that you want to be in a room that you can navigate. You want enough light in the room that you can see the tables and the chairs, that you're not going to trip over a wastebasket, that you're not going to trip over somebody's backpack, but no lighter than that. And that room in there right now, and during the daytime, just like it is right now, where the printer's in there, is almost perfect. So that gives us our black point, our dark, that helps set the dark value. So the environment of your room as well as your monitor. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. So I'm looking around the room. This is largely a black and white crowd. There's a little bit of color in here, not too much color in here. One of the problems that we run into that's based on this very same issue that we're dealing with right here is that people who wear brightly colored clothes while they're retouching. So you may not pay attention to this or be thinking about this, but you wear that really bright, let's see, who would be a red? Oh, Bulls. There you go. You're wearing your Chicago Bulls regalia, all that red, right? And you're sitting in front of your monitor. You've got light coming out of your monitor, so you're not really aware of the fact that you are being reflected in your monitor. Everybody look at that screen right here. You can see, turn your screen off and you'll see your face in the monitor. These are all high gloss monitors, horrible to retouch on, horrible. Because they reflect whatever it is you're wearing. So again, if you're wearing red, what ends up happening is that it puts a red cast on your monitor. Therefore, you go in and you color correct it. But again, the problem is not your file. It's not that your file has a red cast. It's your monitor has a red cast because you're wearing red clothes. I only retouch in black, although I pretty much only do everything in black. So, but nonetheless, it's just something to keep in mind. The walls of the room that you're in. This is horrible. This big old orange, red, whatever ochre color wall over here, that's an abortion to have in a graphics building. That's somebody who's sleeping with the president who got the painting contract because she wanted to be an interior designer for the week. Have you noticed how fucking ugly the colors are for most of the building, most of the interior floors all over this campus? It is horrible. Every time I get out of the elevator at my office, the 12th floor, whatever, I'm like, oh God, no. Please no. But at any rate, yeah, what can I tell you? So at any rate, if you want to get hyper anal about this, you want to have a room that's got a light level of 4 lux, and you want your walls painted a Munsell gray 8. It's either a 7 or an 8. I think it's an 8. It's a neutral gray. It's relatively dark. It's pretty much like the desktop in Photoshop. It's about that dark of a gray. And you only want to wear neutral colored clothes. Again, you need to lock down your environment. So one of the things that blows me away is that people in the old days in this space over here, also in the older days when we were on 11, whatever, they would go into that space to start editing, and it would be 10 o'clock in the morning. And all the window shades will be up, and it's being flooded with sunlight, so it's a very bright room. And they're editing, and you guys know this is true. I mean, I know all of you, like me, are dedicated, love what you do, and it's nothing for you to put in 6, 8, 10 hours. And so you do your 10-hour stretch, and now it's 8 o'clock at night. It's pitch black outside, and you're still editing away like nothing has changed. Your black point has changed dramatically, hugely, because it started out really light in the morning. Whatever choices that you made about tone then are completely invalid by the time it becomes really dark outside and you're in an almost black room, because your black point has dropped considerably. So you can't edit in a room that's got variable light level. You just can't do it. Can you do certain things? Yes. You can be doing your compositing work. You can be, trying to feather edges together, get selections to fit and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes time to do tonal or color correction, either one of those, you have got to get in a lockdown, non-varying, calibrated environment. Make sense? All right. Subtractive colors. So in the subtractive color system, we have cyan, magenta, and yellow. I'm going to leave K out of here for just 1 second, but I'm going to do cyan, magenta, yellow. So remember when we started with talking about our additive color system? We started with black, a monitor that has no tone or color in it at all. We start to add energy. We're adding energy to create light, and that's why they call it an additive system. In a subtractive system, what ends up happening is that you start with a piece of white paper, and what inks do, well, here, before I get to that part, let me ask you this. Why is this pad yellow? When you look at this, why do you see this legal pad as yellow? Anyone? And how does that happen? Why are there's a lack of all other colors? What's going on? Can you describe that system at all? Yeah, but so basically what happens is whatever they've dyed this thing, whatever they use to make this thing yellow, the pigment dye, whatever they use to dye this thing with, it absorbs all the light, all the colors of light except for yellow, and it rejects the yellow, so the yellow bounces back and you see the yellow. But what's important to remember about this is that what's really just as important happening as yellow's being reflected from this is that all the other colors other than yellow, the whole rest of the color spectrum, whatever, is being absorbed by this whatever chemical they use to dye this thing. The way you end up working with pigment is that pigment goes onto white paper and it absorbs all of the colors other than itself, and it reflects itself. So in the case of this cyan pigment right here, it's absorbing all the reds, all the blues, secondary, not reds, it's all the magentas and all the yellows. All are being absorbed. Only the cyans are actually being reflected here. But that subtractive process is what you need to keep in mind here. So cyan, magenta, and yellow are primaries. The red, green, and blue are the secondaries. So again, in this situation now, if we take magenta ink and we mix it with yellow ink, we get red. If we take magenta ink and mix it with cyan ink, we get blue. And if we take cyan and mix it with yellow, we get green. If we mix all of these three together, in theory, we should get black, but we don't. And the reason we don't is because pigments are actually real things. They're real organic substances. And unfortunately, in the entire history of the world, they've never been able to find pigments that are pure enough to actually have this happen. This is what will happen in theory, but it doesn't happen in real practice. The problem is that the real sticklers in this are, well, magenta and yellow are relatively efficient. They're relatively good. You can get relatively pure. You can't get totally pure. That doesn't exist for any of them. But cyan is a real outlier. Cyan has been the problem child forever. Not that the other two are perfect, but they're better. But anyway, so the problem is that when you are in a very light colors, this mixing of these three colors does a very good job at getting to a neutral gray up in the what we would call, it's going to be above the midtone. So if you think about tonal structure, you have, Photoshop doesn't really call it this way, but we can call it this way. You'd have the blacks, so if we're thinking about a tonal scale starting from black and going up all the way to white, you would go into blacks, then you would have 3/4 tones, midtones, quarter tones, and then highlights. The blacks can be rephrased as shadows, so a lot of people will do shadows, 3/4 tones, midtones, quarter tones, highlights, that kind of stuff. Anyway, in the quarter tones and the highlights are where you get color casting, and the three subtractive primaries do a pretty good job of actually getting that. But once you start to get around middle gray, they really lose their effectiveness, and instead of black, you end up with a really shit brown. And the darker you need to get it, the uglier the brown actually really is. So what happens to fix this is that in the printing industry, millennia ago, they figured out once we start getting darker, we are going to start pulling out these cyan, magenta, yellow pigments, and we're going to replace them with a neutral black. And so that's how you can control black in the deeper tones of this setup right here in subtractive. Is that making sense to everybody what we're sort of talking about? Anyway, and that's where K comes from. The reason they don't have K listed as B is B stands for blue in this whole system. So K actually stands for key, and what keying refers to, it's a cinema term where you would key something out. So for the people in here who are doing or thinking about doing any sort of chroma key work, key is the catchphrase here. Keys are basically masks that they use in the film game. So in the old days, most of those things were hand painted. So in the modern days right now, you get software to generate it, but basically it's a mask. So anyway, and they're all done with black. So that's where key represents black ink. Does that sort of make sense? All right. So you'll see this come up. In this case, again, theoretically, certainly in the top end, we should be able to get away with just the three primaries. But, okay, so this works by absorbing light. You start with white. You subtract amounts of RGB or subtract amounts of RGB for any color. Pure CMYK inks do not exist. Equal amounts of CMYK do not equal neutral gray. This is one of the two compelling reasons that we edit in RGB and not in CMYK. The problem with CMYK is that depending on what your tonal brightness is, the relationship, the ratios of CMY change radically in there. And there's the people who have actually figured this out are scientists that are working in math that no one in this room ever wants to face. Black is not equal to amounts of CMYK at its maximum intensity, and that's why you end up having the need for K for black. How white is white? What is now controlling my white point here? Again, I'm in an opposite system. In my additive system, I start with black, and I move all the way up to white if I add all of my light. In my subtractive system, I start with white and I move down to black, right? I'm subtracting light to reach black. So, what's the whitest white I can have? Yes, the piece of paper. Doesn't get any whiter. You can throw more light on it. You're not making it whiter, you're making your environment brighter. Does that make sense? All right. How many of you guys have seen this before? Color wheel, right? Standard color wheel. This is the standard model. A lot of people say, oh, well, you know, it can be oriented any way. We could twist this, you know, we could turn it, you know, we could rotate it like a clock. We do that. This is the standard setup of it, and there's various reasons that they have it standardized here. So I want to actually take a look at this and talk about this, because this begins to introduce a lot of aspects of what we do in this class. But again, I said this to you in the very beginning. It helps, for me anyway, if I understand the process from a logical point of view, I don't need to memorize anything. And I can do the same thing here. So I'm going to try to explain the logic of this behind you and how it's all laid out. So when they started with the color wheel, what they took was, again, this is going to be one that's based on RGB. They took and they placed the red, green, and blues as far as they could from each other on this clock face. That's just the way I'm going to phrase it here. So, how many degrees are in a circle? 360. You guys have heard that. You know, oh, I'm going to do a 180. That means you turn around exactly the opposite way and go back. Or, you know, or he's doing 360s in the snow and the parking lot, that kind of stuff, whatever. So 360 degrees is a full circle. So they start this out with a full circle here. And then they set those coordinates for red, green, and blue as far away from each other as they can possibly do. So to do that, they simply divided the 360 by 3 and they get 120 degrees. And that's where they actually set green and blue. So if we see red at 3 o'clock, that's where we're going to start. That is at 0 degrees. And this location is standardized. You're going to see this other places. 0 degrees represents red. Then if we go clockwise, 120 degrees, we get to blue. And so you'll see blue right down here in parentheses. It's a negative 120. That's just indicating its direction. If we go back to red and then go to green, we actually get a positive 120 degrees. And then the distance between green and blue is also 120 degrees. So our primaries are as far apart from each other as they can possibly get. However, in doing that, you take the two opposite colors from the one that you are talking about. So in our case, if we're talking about red, I'm going to take the two other colors, the not color that I picked. So in my RGB version, I'm picking red, so that leaves me green and blue. If you mix equal amounts of green and blue together, you get cyan. And cyan is the complement of red. So what do we mean by complement? What that really means is it is the color that you can add to reduce saturation of a particular color. So in this scale, you can actually see, or in this illustration, that red is at 3 o'clock, cyan is at 9 o'clock. Cyan is exactly the opposite color of red. If I add equal amounts of cyan and red together, it will start to bring my points towards the middle. And when I get to the very center right here where it says gray, this very center right here is neutral gray. But now two things have happened here that you need to keep in mind. Number one is that my primaries, RGB, are as far apart as they can get. My secondaries are made up by adding the two colors that are not in my equation right here, not the red, but the two others. When those are mixed together, it makes cyan. Cyan is exactly the opposite from red, but also what's happening in this illustration right here is saturation. This is an illustration of saturation. The single most saturated red you can get is all the way out here on this very edge. As you start to move towards the middle by adding its complementary color, you lose saturation, and by the time you've lost all saturation, you guys know, you take a color in the image into Photoshop, you completely desaturate it, you have a grayscale, right? Does everybody know this? Anybody not know that? Okay. And then the same thing goes true for my others. So in my green primary right here, again, the opposite of this would be the two colors that are not in the RGB. The two that would be left other than the green would be red and blue. You combine those together, you get magenta. Magenta is the complement of green. And then finally, the same situation, blue, we're not dealing with green and red. Those combined together equal yellow. Yellow is the complement of blue. And again, the same thing holds true. As you start to add yellow to the blue, it starts to become gray. The minute you hit exactly equal amounts of both, you end up with a neutral gray in the very middle of here. Does this make sense? Now, are we good on this part? I know part of this might seem, well, yeah, Versa, that's just academic. Everybody knows this stuff, right? All of this comes into play for us, though. It helps if you realize this. So, CMYs are in between. Each color is a mix of RGB. Each color is opposite. Yep, we've got all that. Mixing amounts of equal amounts of this equals gray. Saturation is greatest at the edges, and the center is a desaturated gray. So I'm going to jump out of this for a second. I need everybody in Photoshop with me really quickly. Let me get my notes up on this real fast. So hang on just one second. I don't have my notes on that, but that's okay. I can wing this. All right, I got to jump out of here for a second. I'm going to go into Photoshop. I need everybody to click on the color picker. So if you take a look at your Photoshop screen, on the toolbar that's on the far left-hand side, down toward the very bottom, you will actually have two patches of color. In my case right now, I've got a yellow and a white. You guys probably have some other color there. Most of it, the default of this is black and white. To get to the default, you simply hit the D key. You simply hit the D key. That's not a good sign. Well, it worked then. All right. Nonetheless, you hit the D key. It will default your foreground and your background colors. Foreground color is always the one that's on top, slightly to the left. Background color is always the one that's slightly to the right and lower. It's supposed to appear like it's behind that color. So foreground and background color matter to us. We talk about them all the time. We use them to shift those colors, to flip them back and forth. You'll notice, well, actually you'll also notice, to get to your default colors, see the smallest little icon in the world that's up to the upper left-hand side right above the foreground color? If Photoshop could make it small, they could just make it a dot, just a single pixel. I mean, that's the direction they're heading. At any rate, I think they imagine everybody's working on a 128-foot monitor. You know, like, yeah, anyway. But again, the D key shortcut's easier, but that little baby icon at the top will default your foreground and background colors to their default black and white. There's also a little double-headed arrow up there. If you click on that, it actually will flip your colors, so it just flips background and foreground. The easier, again, I told you guys already, I don't use many keyboard shortcuts, but I do use these. The X key does it much faster, so X key will actually flip the two back and forth. It doesn't matter what your foreground color is, simply click on it once and it will bring up what they call the color picker. And if you take a look at your color picker right here, I've just moved mine into the center. What I want to point out to you here is that you've got 4 sets of ways to describe color in the color picker. It's these groups of radio buttons and boxes that you can fill. The first of the groups are the HSB group. It stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. We will talk about what that is in just a minute. Underneath that group is the RGB group. That will also allow you to describe any color. Over to the right side and on to the very top, we go to an LAB system. We talked about that briefly when we looked at the car last week. And then finally, you've got the CMYK method of describing color right here. And you can see what exactly I was talking about. So for me, I'm going to actually ask you guys to get to the same color that I'm going to get to. We're going to start out primarily working in RGB, so I'm going to give you values in RGB. At different times later on, we will deal with different systems as well. But to start this, if you select, it doesn't matter what color you have going on right now, but if you select the enter box for your red value, so right next to the R, select that enter box, put in a 0, then hit your tab key. It will take you down to the green box, put in a 0, and then your tab key again and go down to the blue box and put in a 0 for that as well. So what we are doing now is that we are going to look at the tonal scale that we work with here to keep that's sort of the foundation, the underpinning in Photoshop. So I want you to click on the B button, the radio button for brightness. So we've got 0 red, 0 green, 0 blue, and that's why our screen is black. The color that we have here is black. But I'm going to click on the B radio button right now. That stands for brightness, and I'm going to change the brightness. And what you'll see is that I'm just going to go from dark to white. So and I'm going to pass through all the middle grays in here. I'm not going to change my hue or saturation in any of this, but if you take a look at the column right now, whatever radio button you pick, this column becomes a preview of. So because I clicked brightness, this is now a preview of brightness. If you grab the 2 little arrows that are sitting down at the very bottom and start to drag them up, you will see that you start to move into different shades of gray. What you'll also notice is that the RGB values remain exactly the same relative to each other. Wow, that's so weird. It looks like an 80 up here on the screen, and I know it's not. Anyway, and if you take it all the way up to the top, we come up to 255, 255, 255, which is white. So what this is telling you is that with an 8-bit image, you have 256 tones of gray that you can deal with, right? And the way you get that is I'm loath to get into bit depth here really quickly, but how many people in this room have an idea about bit depth, what it really is? Okay. We're going to take a quick jaunt out to the side, because we make decisions based on this, and if you guys are not making your decisions based on this, if you don't understand what it is you're doing, then we're in trouble. So hang on one second. Binary system. Again, don't let the language with that like freak you out, whatever, but this matters to understand what we're talking about here. So, binary system, basically it's a system that just has 2 possible numbers in it, 0 and 1. And all computers deal with it. This is every computer that we're dealing with in here, basically it understands patterns of 0s and 1s. There are no other numbers in here native to the computer itself. So if we start out with just a typical switch right here and 2 light bulbs, no, it's a light bulb. So those are just my possibilities. So 1 switch, and the switch can either be on or off. So it's either turned off, the white light bulb, or it's turned on, the yellow one. Does that make sense for everybody what's going on in this illustration here? So I have 2 possibilities, on or off. That's it. If I add a switch to this and I look at the number of possibilities, in my second switch I can have both of them can be off, which is on the far left-hand side. Both of them can be on the far right side, or one is off, the other one's on, and then in my middle possibility, it's just the opposite. Does that make sense to everyone, what's going on? And if I add another switch to this, I end up with 8 possibilities. So you can see that what's happening here is that my possibilities grow exponentially. I started with 2. When I added a switch, that doubled, and I got 4. When I added another switch, it doubled again, I got 8. If I add a fourth switch here, it's going to double again. I'll go to 16. A fifth switch, again. Does that make sense, everybody, what's going on? So we're going to count this out just in terms of numbers of possibilities. I'm going to start with a 1-bit image. It's 2 possibilities, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. By the time I do that 8 times, an 8-bit image gives me 256 possible tones of gray. Does that make sense, everyone? So if you zip through this without looking at all why that happened, oh shit. Sorry, I thought there was something else in here in this lecture part that's actually not in here. So, but anyway, does that make sense to everybody, what we're talking about here? So 8-bit means I have 256 possible values, and I can assign a tone to each value. By definition, 0 is black, 255 is white. The reason it's not 256 is because 0 actually is a tone. It's black. So that gives me 256 total. 128 is middle gray. Are we good on all that part? So that works great for grayscale. They do the very same thing for color. In color, you end up with a scale of reds that start at 0 and they go up to 255. Those are all my reds. They start at greens, 0, up to 255 in the greens. Here, we're going to actually look at it. Let's look at it in Photoshop. So go back into Photoshop. I just want to make sure you understood the scale part. Is everybody good and comfortable with 0 to 255? Okay, come back down and click on the red radio button. Click on the red value as well and type in a 0 for the red. Hit the tab key as 0 for the green. Tab key is 0 for the blue. With the radio button clicked next to the R value, the column becomes my red slider. It gives me all the values of red that I can have. And you can see right now with the 2 arrows at the very bottom, I have got a red that is of 0. So this is not just a black, this is a red black. For purposes of Photoshop, a red black is different than a green black that's different than a blue black, even though they all look black to us. So anyway, I'm going to grab those little color sliders, the arrows at the bottom, and start to drag them up. And you can see, look at the preview, the new value that's sitting right up in here. That's showing you what you're actually getting to. And as you start to crank up, you can see I go all the way up to a pure red, to the most saturated pure red that I've actually got. If I drag it back down, I go back down to a black red. If you click on the green slider, you do the exact same thing. It will give you the entire range of greens. If you come back down and drag it all the way back down, click on the blue slider and drag it all the way up, you do the very same thing with blues. If you want to figure out the total number of colors that are possible for you in this, you multiply the 256 reds times the 256 blues times the 256 greens, and you end up with 16.7 million colors, which is a lot of colors. It's actually more than your eyes can see. Is this making sense, everyone? Liam? Considerably more. So I will show you. Hang on one second here. Because it's a good, solid question. I'm sorry, what? The whole video will be on Canvas. Will be on YouTube. Yeah. So this is how you ultimately do bit depth calculation. It looks just like this. So if somebody says to you, I have an 8-bit image, you lay out 8 2's and you multiply themselves by each other. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, times 2 is 32, times 2 is 64, times 2 is 128, times 2 is 256. 256 possible tones. If we do this in 8-bit for RGB, again, you've got 256 reds, 256 greens, and 256 blues, and you multiply those all together and you get 16.7 million whatever. However, the thing that's staggering about this, because this can really happen, is that this is what happens to bit depth and number of tones that you have for grayscale. So you can see with 1 bit you have 2 colors of gray. If you have 4-bit you have 16 colors. If you have 8-bit you have 256. If we go down to 16-bit you have 65,536 tones of gray. Look what happens to color. In a single bit image for color, you end up with 8 bits. In 8-bit with color, you've got 16,777,000. But look at 16-bit color. In 16-bit color, you've got 281,476,710,656 possible colors. Photoshop can actually handle 32-bit color. So look down here. Can somebody tell me what that number is? Oh, it's actually, this is in the range. You know, the number, the word Google refers to like a gazillion, a really big, a lot of zeros, right? But at any rate, you can see here that just in the grayscale version of it, you have 4,294 plus tones of gray. This is why when we were talking earlier about ProPhoto being a very large space, needing the extra data to describe that space without having your data points so far apart that you actually see banding or the absence of color, you don't get you don't get what appears to be continuous tone. Does this make sense? Yes.
So we can't see all those colors.
Oh no.
So why even do it?
So this came up last week. So why did they make ProPhoto? Why did that really exist in the beginning? It was created when people were still primarily shooting film, specifically transparency film. And what they needed was a color space that was big enough to actually, when you scan something, to hold the color. They couldn't see it on a monitor because the monitors don't have that broad of a range that you can, space that you can actually look at. But you could at least grab the color. And so what ended up happening when Fuji, everybody blames Fuji on this one. When Fuji first came out with, did any of you guys ever shoot transparency film? So in transparency film, you get much more saturated color than you get in negative color film. So, and then Fuji, when they launched Velvia, they created what they called super saturation films. So they were really highly saturated. I mean, you could have really saturated, primarily yellows, is what ProPhoto goes after. So they built this giant space in order to be able to capture that color and still keep colors of yellows, let's say it's in the yellow range, yellows that were near one another that didn't get compressed into being just one color. That's why they did it. But with everything, you know, there's two edges to every knife, right? So yeah, so that was a good thing. But now, again, it's causing people a ton of problems because people like Adobe have come out and said, oh, well, ProPhoto should just be your natural color space. So they set all their defaults to actually stay into ProPhoto, but then they never bother to tell anybody that you have to be in 16-bit or you will get the worst banding, pixelation, whatever you could possibly imagine. We good on this part? Okay. Yes. So you're going to see this today. We're actually going to go through a complete workflow today for a single image. And you'll see for me, the way I work, bit depth doesn't really matter as much to me because I embed my raw data into my Photoshop files and I keep that accessible to me. So regardless, I have the raw data, and you can't get more color and you can't get a greater bit depth than your raw data, because that's the first generation. Make sense? So whatever your camera actually outputs, you will never have greater bit depth. You will never. I mean, you can have greater bit depth, but it's meaningless, It's like taking, well, here, let's say this. In this room, the space that's occupied by this legal pad is the only thing in the world that I care about. And it's surrounded right now by, it's got like a 1 foot border around it, right? But this is the essential part. I can extend that border. I can say, well, it's not going to be a 1 foot border around here. It's going to be a 20 foot border around here. This thing still doesn't get any bigger. Anyway, I don't know that it answered the question. From the looks of it, I'm going to say no, but we'll go on. Hopefully in the course of the rest of this will begin to make more sense. Okay, so back to the whole Photoshop thing and the color picker. I just want everybody to be on the page about this 0 is black, and then 255 in grayscale would be white, but also in our RGB system, equal amounts of that will also climb and give us all the colors that are, all the tones that are actually in between, as long as my RGB values are the same. We good on this part? But then also realize if you just click on any random color here in the middle, so I clicked on this orange, look at the values that I get. I've got a red of 224, a green of 143, and a blue of 0. There's no blue in that. It's almost the opposite. Again, if the complementary color of blue is yellow, it's in the yellow region here. But that those different amounts of those colors can create all the other colors of the rainbow that we're talking about. We good on that? All right. Okay, so we got through all of this. Oh, we didn't get through all of this. So going back to our color wheel here, sorry. I jumped way ahead. Okay. So we've gotten through our color wheel right here. All of that part is great. However, the one and the last thing in here that matters in this, what is missing in this illustration of color? And you can see it right now. It just came up in the very bottom. I have no brightness. There's no black in here, is there? There's no white in here. There's no light gray in here. There's no light yellow in here. There's none of that here. All of this is describing to you right now is hue and saturation. What's missing here is brightness. So, we've already gone through that. Oh, that's where my whole things were. I kept looking for this in my note. So, what is tristimulus? All the colors in the spectrum can be described in terms of 3 values or stimuli. Human eyes are tristimulus. Our eyes are RGB. It can be plotted in 3 dimensions. This is really important about where we're heading next. It does not have to be primaries, though. Again, if that gets a little confusing, we're going to see it in a second. Don't worry about that. So, again, you'll hear me screaming this across the room. Yeah, you'll just hear me screaming this across the room because I don't have a mic that'll reach over here. But I'm going to go to the back of the room here. I need everybody to look back here to see what it is that I'm trying to describe here and talk about. So what I want you to imagine is that this is a solid corner right here. So imagine this wall comes all the way here. This is just a solid corner right here, right? And however tall this room is, so let's say the ceiling is probably, let's call it 10 feet tall, just to be easier to say. Okay, so it's 10 feet tall. So what I want you to imagine here is a space right in here where the ceiling is 10 feet tall, this wall goes out and stops at 10 feet, and this wall goes out and stops at 10 feet. So I have a perfect cube here, right? 10 feet tall, 10 feet that way, 10 feet that way. Does that make sense to everybody what's going on here? So that's kind of the illustration that you've got going here. Now, we're going to do axes here for color. So if you take a look at the illustration right there, if we go, I'm going to start with the green one. It's the easiest one to think about. So here in the corner right here, if I start in the very bottom corner right here, where all 3 of these walls match, right? This wall matches, and the floor matches. If I start in that corner right there, that's 0, 0, 0. It's black by definition. If I go straight up to the ceiling, I don't come out this way at all. I don't come out this way at all. I simply go up to the ceiling. 255 green is sitting right at the very top, scale, we just shot up. That's what would be going along this back edge all the way up to the top to the ceiling here. Green is my height in this. Make sense? Okay, my next one is going to be red. So the red axis actually goes, again, I'm going to start down the same corner, 0, 0, 0, black. But as I go along the floor over to this edge right here, I don't come up at all. That would add green if I came up. I don't come up at all. And I also don't come out in the room at all because that's blue. If I get to that far corner up there, all the way at the floor, no green. Not out in the room here, no blue, but the maximum amount of red. I've got pure red sitting out here at the edge. Does that make sense, everyone? And then my final one is blue. I'm going to come back here to my 0, 0, 0 point here. And now I'm going to run along the floor in this direction. I'm not going up at all. That would be adding green. I'm not coming out at all this way. That would be adding red. And I get to this little corner out here on the floor. Not out in this space at all. That's a pure blue. Does that make sense, everyone? So in doing that system, three-dimensional system, I can create all of the colors in the world. Because if you imagine now, I go all the way up to the ceiling, all the green I can get. I come all the way out to this top edge up here. I've now added all the blue that I can. And then finally I've come out to this top corner right over here. I've got all the red I can add, all the green I can add, and all the blue I can add. That point is white, which is the opposite of the black that's sitting right down there. Does that make sense? What's right here in the very middle of the space? Neutral gray, middle gray though, right? If I were to go higher or lower, actually it's not. The axis is from that corner to this corner. So if I were to go up to that or down to that, I would change my value of gray, right? Up to there I'm getting lighter grays, down to there I'm getting darker grays, but right in the very middle of that cube is a perfectly neutral middle gray. Does that make sense to everyone?
So is it not the opposite color, but the, I guess, kitty corner color?
So again, what you can't see would be, imagine the corner that's all the way through in the back there at the floor would be black. The one that's all the way right up here that's also in this cutaway would be white. Okay? So hang on a second. This will hopefully make sense in a little bit. But what you see here is that color is three-dimensional. You have to have it three-dimensional. If we go back to our color wheel, what we were missing here is brightness is missing. This is a two-dimensional space. This has got width and height that has no depth. For me, I got three primaries. I've got to have three coordinates. Three coordinates make it three-dimensional, as opposed to two coordinates making it two-dimensional. All right. So in this case, and this is critical for this, in this case there's a unique point for each and every color. Color now is defined by location. These were the first experiments that were done that really tried to say, we need to get away from me saying to you, oh yeah, could you go get me that red shirt? Right? Well, what's red to you is not red to me. So what they wanted to do was get away from describing color using words like red and green and turquoise and whatever. They now are going to talk about defining color by location in this space. So if we take a look at this right here, you can see on my scale of 0 to 255, my scale of red, which is the scale that's actually coming from this edge all the way out in this direction, you can see this little point right here. It's not very far out. It doesn't have a ton of red. It's got about a fifth of the red that you could possibly have, because we could have up to 255 reds, right? That's not what's going on here. So in my green axis right here, green is about halfway up this scale. So again, it's got about half the green in here. And then blue, which is the scale coming all the way out here, it's almost all the way out to this edge right here. So it's more blue than anybody else. These three coordinates determine its location in this space, and therefore its color. By location, not by name. Does this make sense, everyone, what's going on here? All right. However, It does not have to be primaries. In this case, this is an RGB system. It's actually a very horrible system for us to work in, but we'll talk about why that is and why it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. HSB, hue, saturation, and brightness, are not primaries. RGBs are primaries, CMY are primaries, but HSB is not a primary. It's a completely different system that we can use now to describe space. And because space now, color is determined on location in space, HSB can also describe color. So this is ultimately what it's going to look like. I need everybody, if you're on Windows, you can't do this because this is a Mac-only utility, but you can just watch. If you're on a Macintosh, I need everybody to go to their Finder, go to your Application folder, scroll down to the Utilities folder, and inside the Utilities folder, there's this thing called Color Sync Utility. If you double-click on that, it will launch. When it actually opens up, you'll notice, your screen may look very different than mine, but you'll notice up at the very top, there's a series of tabs that run, or icons that run across the top. There's a profile first aid. You don't want to pick that. You want to pick the icon that's right next to it, the one that just says profiles. And when you do that, you'll actually have then on your left-hand side, there'll be a left-hand column. I'm going to collapse mine because otherwise I've got a lot more on mine than most of you guys are going to have on yours. So I want ours to actually look the same. You should see a system, computer, users, and other up here on your left-hand side. Yes? So go to your application folder. You good? All the way down to utilities. I say down, that's because I use mine as columns, but you got it? Inside utilities is Color Sync Utility, and that's what you want to launch. So if I can get you guys to click open the system drop down, inside of this you should see some familiar players in here. For instance, you should see sort of at the bottom sRGB. If you click on it, you will then get a preview of the sRGB color space. If you then come over to the color space, the illustration of it, whatever, you'll see you get a little hand, and you can click on this hand and you can move your color space around. This is the true three-dimensional color space of sRGB. And if you orient this to a point where you get the little white cross on the top and the little back cross on the very bottom, this is how most people view color spaces. So if we think about this, don't think about this as the sort of like cube shape it's got. Think about this as more like a globe. If you think about this as a globe, what you will see is that at the North Pole you've got white, at the South Pole you have black, at the equator you have your most saturated colors. Inside of the very middle of the Earth you have neutral gray. As you start moving from the middle of the Earth out to the edges, you start increasing saturation. As you start moving from the middle of the Earth up to the North Pole, you start getting brighter, and if you go down to the South Pole, you get darker. That's what's going on here. Make sense? Oh, we're going to get to that in just a second. So yeah, why isn't it this perfect globe? Yeah, there's a reason. Anyway, what I'd like you to do at this stage of the game is, if you can see in this little illustration part where we're at, there is a little triangle that's in the very top left-hand corner where it says LAB plot. Click on that and you can come down and say you want to hold this thing for comparison. So again, this is sRGB. This is the default space that Photoshop uses. Then come back over to your system profiles on the column that's on the left-hand side and click on Adobe RGB, and yeah, that will screw this up. So because I've just swallowed my entire space. So we need to do the opposite. So you can leave Adobe RGB selected, come over to that little triangle again, the LAB plot, come down and do clear comparison. Then right back to it again at hold for comparison, and then click on sRGB again. And what you can see is this is the difference in the color space of sRGB and Adobe RGB. So if you take a look at the ghosted out areas that are right over here in this whole green area right here, that is all color that Adobe RGB can show you that sRGB cannot. And the problem that we have is that your cameras are capable of at least this Adobe RGB, but if you didn't change your default working space in Photoshop from sRGB to Adobe RGB, all of this color that you see ghosted out in white would be thrown away when you actually opened your file up into Photoshop. sRGB is not a whole lot larger than what you can print. Does this make sense? So my suggestion is that you go home tonight and you get all fucked up on your favorite drug of choice, put on some Pink Floyd, and just open this up and play with it for hour after hour after hour. Does that sound like something? However, there's a couple things to notice right here. You can also see in here that there are actually colors in sRGB that can be printed right here. This is very, very minor in the reds and the reds and the purples and the blues in here that actually exist in sRGB that don't exist in Adobe RGB. But does that make sense what's going on in here in all of this? So that color cube that I showed you just gives you the idea of dealing with color as a space. But in the way everything works in a digital world, it truly is a space. It is a physical space. Well, it's a mathematical space, mathematical thing describing a physical space, a theoretical space, whatever. And color lives inside of that. All the colors live inside of that. But what we are now doing is that we are defining color by its location inside of that space. So we no longer are dealing with, oh yeah, kind of red-green, which means nothing. Are we good on this part? Okay. You can stay here and play with your little utility for a second. Say what? See, yeah, we'll have a different shape, but it all exists inside of this. It's just going to be, it will have a completely different shape with different boundaries and everything. Yeah. Okay, what is hue? See, this is the most demoralizing part of it all. You guys are, fourth year in art school, and you cannot tell me what hue is. An eighth grader should be able to tell me what hue is. And I don't put that on you. I put that on all the people who come before me who have never taught you that shit. So hue is the property of a pure color that distinguishes it from other pure colors. That sounds like the beginning of an artist statement to me. So a more defined version of it is that the property that gives the color its principal name. So it's red or yellow. So when we say, oh yeah, this is green, we know what that means, that's hue. Or that's red, yeah, we know what that is, that's hue. That's what hue basically is referring to. So in our color wheel system, hue is defined by its position on the color wheel. Again, when we were looking at 0, 3 o'clock, by definition, that is red. If we go to 180 degrees, that's the opposite of red, which is at 9 o'clock, cyan, the opposite of red. It's defined by degrees. So hue, by definition, is degrees. Ironically, and I don't know that it really should be this way, but 0 is red, but so is 360, because 360 lands on the very same spot as 0. Anyway. Oh, here, sorry. In this case, all of these patches have the exact same brightness and the exact same saturation. The only thing that's different in these patches on the bottom is the hue. What's saturation? Intensity. Some people would say purity. Intensity is possibly a part of it. It's a slightly less imperfect word, but anyway, what we can say is about the range. So at one extreme, we have a pure color. At the other extreme, we have a neutral gray. So it is controlled by adding or subtracting the complementary color. So if we have red, a pure red, and we start to add cyan, its complementary color, it starts to desaturate to the point when we have equal values of both, we have a neutral gray. Make sense? Saturation is on a scale of 0 to 100%, so this is no longer our 0 to 255, it's just a percentage. So again, in this case, 128 would be, 50 would be mid-saturation, 100% would be pure saturated, 0% would be no saturation at all. Zero saturation, I just said that. So in this case, when you look at these, all of these are the exact same hue. All of these are the exact same brightness. The only thing that's changing here is the saturation. And you can see I start at pure color, that sort of orangey color on the left-hand side, and I go all the way to a neutral gray on the right-hand side. Brightness. This is the hardest one, I think, for most people, so I'm not even going to bother to ask you guys. But this is the thing to keep in mind. It's a property of a color by which it appears to contain more or less light. So, and brightness is also defined on a scale of 0 to 100, a percentage scale. Every possible color appears black if its brightness is set to 0. It does not matter what color you have. Any orange, any teal, it does not matter. If you drop the brightness down to 0, you will have what appears to be black. In this case, all 7 patches here are the exact same hue, the exact same saturation. The only thing that is changing here is the brightness. So, people have a hard time remembering that, so go back to your Photoshop and also open up the color picker again. And what you can see is you have HSB that's sitting up at the very top. I'm going to zero everybody out again, so select your red value, type in a 0, hit the tab key, your green value 0, tab key, and your blue value 0. It's just giving me black again. I'm starting out. Now you remember I said no matter what radio button you click on, it will actually give you, the column becomes that variable. So if you click on H for hue, you will see that we are set at a red hue. As I start to work my way up, you'll also notice that it's changing. It's going through all of the hues, all this kind of stuff. But my color doesn't change here at all. Why not? My color in my sampler, the sort of the reveal, the new color and the other color, they don't show up here at all. Why is that? I not only have brightness at 0, but I've got brightness, my saturation is also at 0. So make your brightness 100. Make your saturation 100. And now with your hue at 0 degrees, click on the hue radio button to give you that. And now as you start to drag this up, you will see that it previews all of the colors. The only thing that is changing here is hue. The saturation and the brightness remain consistent. So the only thing is changing. So if you all of a sudden, God damn it, I can't remember what hue is, simply come here, click on the radio button for H and start screwing around with that slider and you'll go, oh yeah, that's what hue is, right? So I'm going to, and you'll notice that you get to red all the way at the very top, just like we had down at the very bottom, because again, 0 degrees and 360 degrees is the same. So then leave your hue at 0, click on saturation, and your column now becomes a saturation slider. So if we click from the top and we drag our thing all the way down, we end up with white. Why don't we end up with a middle gray? Exactly, because brightness is set to 100. Brightness is now what is controlling our tonal value. If you click on brightness and then drag it down to 50%, you will have a neutral gray. That is where you get it here. So what you can see in this is that the very same space that I could use to describe this color space, RGB, I can now actually use HSB to describe the exact same space. Does that make sense? And you'll also see that it can happen in LAB values are happening here as well as our CMYK values here. They're also spaces that can also describe color, all based on location. We were talking about this earlier, so with your setting right now, check this out. So has everybody got a neutral gray going on in here in their middle column? So crank your neutral gray up high. Let's go up into the quarter tones up into here. And what you'll notice now, if you look over at your CMYK, you'll notice that what makes up this color is 10% cyan, 7% magenta, 8% yellow, and 0% K. These are the inks that are being laid down. They are very light inks because we don't want that ink to absorb a lot of light. We want light to go in and hit that white paper and come back out to us, right? Remember, inks are a subtractive system. As we start to add more and more ink, it gets darker and darker because the heavier the ink, the more light it absorbs and doesn't reflect back to us. And in a perfect world, eventually it would make that piece of paper so black that no light came back off of it, but that would be theoretical, not real. Does this make sense, everybody, what's going on here? If you crank this down then into the 3/4 tones, come bring it way down here. Look what happens now. You still have very heavy amounts of CMY, but you've also now got K as becoming a major player in this. It's actually taking over. But you'll also notice in this case that cyan, they always need more cyan, and it's because cyan is the least pure of the inks that you can get. So you're always having to add more cyan to make up for its deficiency. The magenta and the yellows tend to play pretty close to one another, but even if you crank this all the way out, you can't crank it all the way up. If you crank it all the way down, you'll see the problem gets even worse here. Those CMYK values changed hardly at all. It's all now K here. It's just all being made by black ink. Make sense? But again, the calculations for CMYK are impossible to do, whereas the ones for RGB are very easy. Yeah, I want a middle gray. Okay, 128, 128, 128. I have no idea what values to put in. Well, here, let's just type it in. Go back to your brightness slider and just crank it up to 50% again. And you can see 127, 127, 127. It's either 127 or 128 is middle gray. But look at the values of CMYK. Are you going to remember that? I'm not. All right. Don't worry, guys. We're getting through this. We're going to take a quick break soon. Okay. So in the color wheel system that we're working with now, hue is defined by its location on the wheel. Here again, you can see 0 degrees for red, 120 for green, 240 for blue. Saturation is at the edges, or its greatest saturation are out here at the very edges. As we start to move in the middle, we're moving towards desaturated color. So the exact center is totally desaturated neutral gray. This is a 2-dimensional space, not a 3-dimensional one. Brightness is missing. So the way they solve this problem in HSB is they take that color wheel, imagine it as a record album, they drop it flat on its side and they add the missing dimension, which is, again, if you imagine this is a globe, it's actually going from the center of the Earth to all the way up to the top to the North Pole, and also from the center of the Earth all the way down to the South Pole. That third dimension gives us brightness. So in this scenario, if you take a look, hue is still the angle that goes around the circumference of this. Saturation is still a movement from the very center, which is totally desaturated, to the edges, which is completely saturated. And then brightness goes from the center of the Earth here, if we think of this as a planet, the center of the planet right here, up to the North Pole goes to white, down to the South Pole goes to black. But why is this not a cylinder? Why is this 2 cones that are inverted on one another? Shoot.
Oh, well, because the black value and the white value don't like more number. It's not like there's not as many possibilities as there are for like the combinations.
But what's changing?
Just the brightness.
Well, the brightness is changing, yes, but what else is changing as we start to move in this direction?
The hue and saturation also become like.
The hue will stay the same, but the saturation moves. So if I'm all the way out here on the edge for red, and I start to come down here, I start to add black to it, as we start to move to lighter or darker, I lose saturation. And as I'm losing saturation, these edges have to come in. It still stays a pure red. That's not the issue. It's just, again, because of the brightness, I'm losing that. So, and you can see it in Photoshop. Go back into Photoshop really quickly. So we are going to crank the brightness all the way, no, we're going to leave the brightness right in the middle. So at 50, crank your saturation all the way up to 100%. And you can see you've got a relatively dark, in my case, I've still got my hue at 0, which is red. So as I start to change the brightness of this, so click on your brightness radio button, as we start to come down, you'll see I'm not changing my saturation at all, but look at the color. There's no way a super dark color can be as saturated as a midtone, or super light color can be as saturated as a midtone, because they're blowing out. And eventually on the white, I get to white, and that's got no saturation at all. So it's pulling those in towards the center, which is removing the saturation. Make sense? All right. So there was this guy named Munsell who really did the heavy lifting in this whole color model system. And this is actually the model system that he built. There's a cutaway obviously here in the center part to pull it out so that you can see the center. But again, what he did was the exact same system that we've been talking about. The hue is on the exterior. It's on the very edge of this model. As you start to move from the center towards the outside, you start going from neutral gray to highly saturated to the very edge, which is the most saturated a color can get. Lights are at the very top, North Pole. Darks are at the very bottom, South Pole. Does that sort of make sense what's going on here? But Haley, this answers your question about why are those spaces not these perfect globes? You can have different colors saturate much greater than other colors. So you can see here, you can get a much more saturated green than you can actually get in the cyans right here. This doesn't come out anywhere near as far. You also, I mean, here in the reds here, you don't get anywhere near, this doesn't saturate near as much as like the greens in this kind of area over here. So the space is not uniform because you can have far more saturated certain colors than you can other colors. And again, saturation is the distance from the center out. So some areas of this world are being pushed further out and some are being held tighter in. And if you take a look again at the color sync utility, you'll actually spot that. Basically it has to do, a lot of this is based on human vision and it's your sensitivity. So if we take a look at this, at the space in this, the way this is typically would be oriented would be something like this. You can see that the reds are the least saturationable. The greens tend to be pretty seriously saturated, as are some of the blues. The magentas not so much. Again, if you need to take a look at how far they sort of like jet out from stuff. But a big part of this has to do with your eyes are not sensitive to color in an equal way. Your eyes are much more sensitive to green than they are to anything else. Why is that? Well, yeah. I mean, ultimately, evolution would explain why, but the more practicality of why that evolved to be the thing that it evolved to be. So if you think about, this is something for you guys all to know too, because this could have a huge impact on your Photoshop editing. If you break down an RGB file into its relative contributions to an image, irrespective of color, you can think of as the red channel primarily deals with contrast, the green channel deals with detail, and the blue channel deals with noise. So why does that matter to you to know that? Well, if you've got a hyperly noisy image, you go in and you blur the blue channel only because you're keeping the green untouched. No noise is in the green channel. It's all in the blue channel. So you soften out the noise in the blue channel, keep the detail in the green channel, and also keep the contrast in the red channel. So that doesn't hold true for every single image, but it is a generalization. If you look at a sensor, we might look at one at some point today. I don't know if we're going to have time, but we might. If you look at a sensor, you will see that on that sensor it has twice the number of green receptors as it does blue and red. And that's because, again, it's being modeled after your eyes. Good on that? All right. I know this seems like a lot, guys, but this ultimately matters. Again, all of you guys, when I ask you to change the car, you whip out the HSB thing, and do you really know what you're fucking with there? Yeah, no. Okay, against my better judgment here, even though we've already gone through this, because this did come up, so I want to make sure, again, we've already gone through all of this, so you don't need to worry about that part. Okay. LAB. So in LAB, the model is very, very, very similar to the way we've actually been looking at this before, but when we were dealing with our color wheel here, we actually still had 3 axes, right? When we looked at the color wheel before we flipped it on its side, remember, going back to here, there are 3 axes here. There's the blue-yellow axis, there's the green-magenta axis, and the red-cyan axis. And then again, when we flip it on its side and we add the 3rd dimension, we get the brightness axis on it. So we've got 4 that we're dealing with. But when you get to LAB, you're actually only dealing with 3. Because what LAB does is it eliminates the 3 axes that describe color, and it changes it only to 2. But that's not a problem. If you go back here and you take a look at this, there is no reason, because what this system uses in RGB is that I need to have an RGB value coordinate to map anything here in this space. But if you were to take just the blue-yellow axis here and then run another one that kind of comes across like this, and they were perpendicular to one another like this, you could use just 2 numbers to describe any space on this, and then again, your 3rd dimension in this would be brightness. Does that make sense, everyone? So this is what LAB does. It simplifies this. So in LAB, what you have is the brightness axis is exactly the same. South pole to north pole is brightness. But in this case, you've only got 2 axes that cross each other that describe color. The easiest one to remember in this is the B axis, because that is blue to yellow. Then you just need the other 2 colors, and the other 2 colors are going to be either, some people call it green to red, some people call it green to magenta. I'm going to use a more familiar term for you guys, and the term I'm going to use, it's very closely related to this. It's not exactly the same, but when you open up, I need everybody to open a file for me in Photoshop really quickly, and I need it to be a raw file. So if you can come to our class, go to session number 2. Inside your student folders for week number 2, there is a folder called 2010 blah 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 33 VER Woods 07. It's this one right here. Did everybody see that one? So again, it's the 20100-327 underscore VER underscore Woods underscore 07. What can anybody tell me about this image? Perfect, right? All of that from the name, right? Instead of like endless number of folders in my Lightroom catalog called trees. Yeah. Anyway, inside there is a single file. Just open up the very first one, the one that's at the very top, the frame number 001. If you've still got your color picker open, you have to cancel out of it, and you should come into Camera Raw. And if we actually take a look at the basic panel and you open up for color, what do you see up here? You see temperature, tint. Isn't that the 2 things that you normally see? If you go back to an older version of Camera Raw, these things were actually at the very, very top. But think about this. We're looking at temperature right here. This is the blue-yellow axis. We're looking at temp. This is the green-magenta axis. And then we're looking at all the exposure in light, and that is the L axis. So this ascribes to exactly the same system as LAB. As a matter of fact, all the color correction that's done in Photoshop is actually done in LAB. It converts all of your stuff into LAB, does the conversions, and then converts it back out to whatever the hell you're using. Is this making sense a little bit? L is lightness, the brightness of your image. So if we go ahead and open this guy up, so simply open it up. It didn't matter. And then come up to your image menu. Well, first off, before you come up to your image menu, look at your channels palette on the left-hand side. You've got red, green, and blue channel, right? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, so depending, we actually may have a problem here. Let's see what the problem might be. So it says, oh, the embedded is displayed degree. I don't know how that happened, because that really shouldn't be. Is it the image of the girl here? Okay, I mean, a little bit where that's part. In this case, you can just use the concept of this case. It doesn't matter. But I do need to do this. Come to the edit menu and go down to color settings. Okay. So you can see if you look at the channels right over here, you've got a red, green, and blue channel. That's what's describing this image right now. But if you come up to the image menu drop down and you come down to mode and then down to LEB color. So look up at my screen really quickly to see where I'm at, and then we're going to take a break. And come down to LEB color and click on that. It will say, do you want to rasterize this image? Because right now it's a smart object. It doesn't matter. You can say don't rasterize or rasterize it. It doesn't make a bit of difference. We're not working on this image. We're just converting it to an LEB image. And now what you can see on your channels right now is a lightness channel. If you click on the channel, you'll see it. It is the tonal range of your image. If you click on the A channel, this is actually what allows the color in the A channel. So this would be the green to magenta axis of our color wheel. This is how it's described. And then the B channel would be the blue yellow. And you can see these now are relatively amounts. This is controlling the amount of color only. It's not controlling tone. That's all established in the lightness channel up at the very top. And the advantage of doing this is that I can now change color here independent. Tone and color are now divided. And that's what Munsell really did, was when he set up that system. And it's the way you see now all of the color spaces that are actually in Photoshop. sRGB, Adobe RGB, ProPhoto RGB, all the other ones that are in there. All the ones, you can get color space of your camera can get in there, color space of printers you can get in there, color spaces of monitors you can get in there. You can get in, they all have color spaces that describe what they can actually show you. Make sense? Liam? Well, number one, you can't call it lab because it's no different than calling RGB. Nobody would do that, or CMYK. I know. I'm just trying to make you, when you're speaking the language, act like you know what you're talking about. And any rookie would, anybody who knows color would think, he really called that lab. It's not lab. It's LEB. Anyway, so I'm sorry. Back to your question now. Say it again. No, it was actually the RGB. So it's really more in an RGB world. You find noise is really dominated in the blue channel. But there are reasons for that. There are physical reasons for that. So noise tends to really permeate in the darker parts of your images. It's because of a lack of data describing the shadow detail of your image and the shadows and darkers of your image. That's where noise really shows itself. It doesn't really show you in the quarter tones and the highlights. You don't pick up noise there, not unless you've really, really fucked up your image. And if you think about the real world that we go out into, where you look at shadow, if you're to photograph, you were just go out on a typical, say like sunsetty day, right? And the sun is setting and you're shooting a picture. In the shadows, where you're in the shadows, whatever, tends to be dominated by blue cast. It's because that's not where the warm sun is. It's actually where the blue sky is reflecting light into that. So the shadow areas tend to be dominated by blue anyway. And so the darker areas of your image, the areas of any given image, in an average setup, tends to have more noise in the blue because that's in the shadow areas, and blues tend to dominate the shadow areas. Does that sort of make sense? What was your other question? That's a great question. You're going to have to hold on that one because we get into talking directly about that. Okay. I think it's time for a break, guys. I got 9:38. Let's make it a hard 10. Be back at 2:48. 10 minutes.
I renewed my phone system.
Oh, you're okay. You're all right. You're all right. Just get on the sign in.
Yeah, sure. And I just bought my own flashlight.
Cool.
Is this the right one?
It can be. We need to see. You might have to. You're using your computer though, right?
Yeah.
Have you already installed the driver for your computer for this?
No.
Oh, you have to do that part. So let's do that right after class. Are you good on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And another thing is like missed first hour of class. What have I missed?
It'll be on the video. You need to watch the video.
Nothing important for the rest of the class.
I'm sorry, what? Oh, yeah, you'll be fine.
Oh.
Yeah, you'll be fine.
Are we setting up Lincoln timers today?
No,
No. Okay. Sweet.
because I forgot mine.
Yeah, and I forgot to bring my.
Okay, so this is basically how the LED space, color space actually works. So here we've separated luminosity, unlike RGB. In RGB, when you actually make an adjustment, you guys should know this. When you make an adjustment in RGB to, say, the red channel, you go in and you just pick the red channel and you put a point on the curve and you drag it down. You're reducing the amount of red, but you're also making your image darker. You cannot divorce tone from color. Now, for the more advanced versions of you guys, you will also know that you could use blending modes to actually restrict that so that it did only control the color, that it didn't impact the luminosity. Those are tricks that Photoshop is actually doing based on the underpinning of LAB is its color engine. So it's giving you the illusion that that's what it's doing. But the truth of the matter is, in an RGB world, red, green, and blue control not only the color, but they control the tone. So again, 000 RGB is black, but 255, 255, 255 RGB is white. So it is not just impacting color, it's actually impacting the tonal range as well. In LAB, it does not work that way. So if you go to your Photoshop color picker one last time and simply click on it, you can actually see that again, we're going to start with black. So if you don't have black, put in 0 red, 0 green, 0 blue, and you will again see that now in our L range, if you click on the L radio button, you'll see that the column becomes this shift from black to white, because again, L only represents the luminosity. If you click on the A though, what you'll end up seeing is, we're going to go ahead and crank our L all the way up, and then click on the A channel. In the A channel, what you'll see on one extreme is magenta, on the other extreme is cyanic. Again, it's not the same exact thing as you have in the color wheel, because again, remember the color wheel's got 3 axes that you're dealing with. This has only got 2 now. So that shift in there is basically what we're looking at here. So this would really be considered the green magenta axis here, and you can see that's not really a green, it's more like a turquoise, but this is also not really a magenta, but it's not really a red either. But it does cross perpendicular to the B channel, and if you click on the B channel, you'll see that this is actually the blue to yellow. And you'll see it's an extremely faint blue, but that's again because I've got the L cranked all the way up. If you start to bring your L down, so say take it down to like a 50, you'll see that it ends up getting the appearance of greater saturation in here. We haven't changed its color and all, but that's it. If you take, though, with the B channel selected, the radio button selected, if you click and you drag all the way to the top, you will see that you get a positive 127 in the B value. If you click and you drag all the way down, you get a negative 128. Neutral is right in the middle. So 0 would actually be a neutral gray. So if we take a look at our LAB world, that describes what's really going on in it in the illustration. This again is different than how we would do it for RGB or HSB. But here you can see in the very center is 0. As you start going out to the positive red or the positive, the green, the red is a positive direction, the green is negative, the blue is a negative direction, the yellow is a positive direction. But it still describes that 256 step scale. It's just that instead it puts 0 in the middle instead of 0 on one end. Does that make sense, everyone? All right. We've gone through all of that. And we've gone through all of that. We have a couple more slides to look at really quickly, guys, and then we are done with this and we're going to actually start working on images. So, color managed workflow, part 1, the problem. RGB and CMYK, HSB, all of these are derived from RGB, and as a result, they have all the same limitations that RGB has. Every single device, every eyeball in the world, every monitor, every sensor, every projector, anything that deals with a digital image has this very same problem. And the problem that we have here is that every single one of them is unique. it is so unique that your eyes don't necessarily actually see color the same. That's how different things can be, much less your eyes and the other 6-7 billion people in the world. Each one of us has our own unique perception of color. And what is my red is not necessarily your red. What's my turquoise is not necessarily yours. And that becomes managing color just this clusterfuck, this hard, I mean, it's just like, how do we get over this problem, right? So there are an infinite number of these spaces. I mean, it's the same thing. One printer will give you one color, another printer next to it will give you another color. One monitor, two monitors right next to each other. One will give you one color and one will give you another color. And that is a problem that we have got to solve. We have got to get away from what we call ambiguous color. We need unambiguous color. So it's easy to convert from one of these to another, but there is no perfect way to do this. So device-dependent color. RGB values, this is the phrase of them all right here. RGB values that produce exact color desired on one device will produce a different value and a different color on another device. And if you've ever stood in front of the wall of TVs at the, at the, Walmart or, Home Depot or wherever it is, right? You see they're all slightly variations of the same kind of, program, whatever. We can't have that. I cannot have something that I'm looking at color on one and think, oh my God, this is perfect, and then send it to Liam thinking he's going to see the same color, and he sees something wildly different. That's just not sustainable. That is not a color managed workflow. So we are going to eliminate that ambiguity. RGB values are monitor dependent. HSB values are also monitor dependent. CMYK values are printer dependent. So how did they solve this problem? A bunch of guys decided, I think there's a few women in here, but it was the 1930s, so who knows, probably not. In 1930s, and they decided we're going to solve this problem. We're going to do the International Color Consortium, and we're going to go to Paris. And I would do the same thing. I mean, if you had a chance to go to a meeting and actually try to solve the problem of consistent describable color, and they said, okay, you can go to Peoria, Illinois, or Paris, where would you go? Right? Okay, we're going to go to Paris. Anyway, so this whole group of people converges on Paris. They call it the ICC, but they're actually, it's French, and I don't speak French, so I can't really, I'm not even going to try to do that. So anyway, what they did was that they came up with a system that allowed them to create unambiguous color, and this is how they started. They started with what they call the standard observer. And so instead of having all of our eyeballs, they created a theoretical person, a synthetic person, a fake person, a person described only mathematically. And they took all of these people and they interviewed them about color. Is this color the same? Do you see this? Whatever. They took all of that information from like thousands of people. They averaged it all together and then built the standard observer based on that. So it is a hypothetical human being, but that hypothetical human being has two eyes that see the exact same color, and it doesn't change ever. And you can describe the color that theoretical human person actually sees. Does that make sense? So they eliminated us as variables. They created this standard observer. Again, it's a theoretical person. It doesn't exist. It only exists in math. It was based on these experiments. Oh, that's the CIE, which again, I forget what the actual, I don't speak French. So anyway, we'll look at this. So here is how it basically works out. Or this is how we're going to deal with it. So you have a file that has a color in it. And the color, just by its location and definition, is a 255 red, a 148 green, and a 21 blue. And you can actually plug that into your little Photoshop right now if you want. Open up your foreground color picker and type in 255 red, 148 green, and 21 blue, and you will see something that looks similar to this color. So if we put this on an uncalibrated monitor, this is what we get. And you can see those colors are not the same. They're not even close, right? My original colors is sort of like ochre-y, sort of a deeper orangey kind of color, whatever. And the color on the screen is almost a pure yellow. So the color values for the monitor uncalibrated measured were 255 red, 248 green, and 53 blue. You can see that the numbers are radically different. The amount of red is the same, but the amount of blue and yellow and green, green and blue are completely different. That's the problem. So then you can actually use a system of software and hardware that will actually calibrate your monitor. So what happens is that when you use this software, you have a piece of hardware, a puck, that you plug into your computer, you run software, the puck lays on your computer. That's what's going on right here. That's what this little black thing is right here. All of these things, not all of them, but 90% of the ones in the world right now are all made by the same company. They're all made by X-Rite. This is actually called, they have different ones of them. For a while they were doing color monkeys. This is an i1 profiler. They have different versions of them. If you decide that it comes a point in your life where you have to have one, and if you get serious about your work, you have to have one, let me know and I'll help guide you to the ones that you can get, because there's more expensive pathways to that, and then there's cheaper pathways as well to this, and the cheaper pathways tend to always blow up in your face. So anyway, what happens is that this thing goes in and measures. So what happens is the software starts throwing all of this color up on the screen, and the software knows what the color is. The puck measures the color. It actually is a spectrometer. It measures the real color that your monitor is putting out. And then it looks to see what's really going on. So when you put the puck on the screen, so what it's saying is that what is the difference between what the file asked for and what the monitor gave me? So it knows on this monitor that when the file part that's asking for 255 red, it knows that it's giving it a 255 red, so there's no problem here. There's no correction that's needed for this. But then it looks at the green, it's measuring this, and it says the file's saying I want 148 green. But the file on my screen is giving me 248 green. Well, that's a huge mismatch. But the measurement here says, okay, I understand that. We need to, when this file comes up, we need to subtract 100 green from this. And then it looks at the blue and it says, okay, the file's asking for 21 blue. My screen is giving me a 53 blue. I need to knock 32 off of this so that they match. So once you've calibrated your monitor and built the profile for it and are using it, what ends up happening is that the profile corrects the mismatch here, and ultimately you end up getting the file color that was asked for is what you get on your monitor. This is now 255 red, 148 green, and 21 blue. Does this system make sense to everyone in here? This doesn't just work for monitors, this works for cameras and for printers. How many people in this room have ever profiled their camera? The fuck do you imagine you can get decent color when you don't even know what your camera's giving you? You're guessing. All of that ends today. Yes? Huge. Hold that thought. Profiles. So profiles are the data that's representing the color reproduction of the characteristics of a device. So it goes in, it does the measurement part of it. However, it's created by measuring a known version. So again, when you use your monitor calibrator, or we're actually going to do one for a camera, when you actually use it, the software knows what the colors really should be. What it's measuring is the derivation from that color, and it takes that derivation, it takes the difference between what it should be and what it's measuring, and builds a table to undo that derivation. And so when you get through it, so they adjust for the derivation, and yeah, we get into, so does this system make sense to all of you guys, what's happening? So if so this is why profiles are specific to a single device. I can do a profile for this monitor, but I can't use that profile for that monitor. Even though this is the same company, it's the same brand of computer, it doesn't matter. These things are all unique. And so if I want to work on this one, I have to profile this one and use its profile. If I want to work on that one, I have to profile that one and work on that one. If I want to work on my laptop, same thing. If I want to go in and use two different printers in the print lab, I actually should profile both independent printers apart from one another. Because again, their derivation from a known standard is not the same. So why on earth would one profile that's dealing with the derivation correctly on one fix the other one? It won't. Does that make sense? Are we good on this part? We'll get to all that in just a second. So working spaces. I need to get through this part so that you can see the whole workflow. So working spaces in Photoshop, these are actually what they call profile conversion spaces, PSCs. You don't need to memorize any of this part, whatever. It's just to know that that's what Photoshop calls them, working spaces. These spaces, by definition, are device independent. These color spaces are not real devices. They are theoretical. They are mathematical. They are made up. And therefore, they don't change from one computer to another. ProPhoto is a working space. Adobe RGB is a working space. sRGB is a working space. These are all mathematical spaces of color. They have just that same weird geometry. I mean, we've already looked at them in the color sync utility. They don't change. My Adobe RGB is identical to yours, is identical to yours, is identical to yours. So if I get my file into my Adobe RGB space and it is correct color, if I give it to you and you put it in yours, it's gone into the exact same space. Nothing will have changed. And so you have an unmodified copy of the file that I gave you, and its color is intact. It has not been changed into a device-dependent space. So here's the Holy Grail, and this is how it all boils down. So in this illustration right here, we've got, let's say I've got a scanner over here or a camera, it doesn't matter. We're looking for input device. I need to put that through either the camera profile or the scanner profile to remove the device dependence of the camera. So this is going to be your sensor. Your sensor is biased. And you guys don't do anything about fixing that. You just start to merrily start throwing curves and shit at it. Oh yeah, it's too red, I'm gonna add some blue. Isn't that how you guys color correct? Yeah, right? You go all the way. You know how many test prints I do for my printing? To my workflow right now, I might pull a single, what I'll do is I'll pull a full-blown color print to begin with. I may have one correction that I make and pull a second one, but that's it. And I've never changed that. I've never had a test print done. I had them do murals here. I don't ever have test prints done. I'm that confident in my color. I want you to be the same place. All right, so anyway, to get to this, whatever, it goes through your profile conversion into whatever your ingested software is. So this could be Camera Raw, this could be Capture One, this could be, anybody here use any other RAW processors? So how many of you guys ever do film in the darkroom? Anybody? Oh, raise your hand and be proud. Jesus, you act like I'm gonna say, get out of this class. No. So when you develop film, do you always use the same developer? Have you ever used another developer? Oh, that's so sad. Especially in black and white. In color, it's very different. In color, it's really pretty restricted. But in the world of black and white, there's hundreds of developers for film to do different things. And they all give you slightly different flavors of the same thing, or radically different flavors. Well, this exists in the world of raw processing. So there's tons of them out there. There's a company called DxO that makes a beautiful processor. There's a free one called, well, used to be free, may not be free anymore, Bibble. It's also a raw processor. We've already talked about Capture One. We've already talked about Camera Raw. Lightroom, also using Camera Raw. So there's a bunch of, if you go out in the real world, whatever, there's hundreds of raw file processors that will give you slightly different flavors. I don't know about you, but anybody in here process all their stuff in Capture One by any chance? Anybody fashion in here or beauty? If you're really serious about your fashion and beauty stuff, most of us would never use the skin tones that are put out by Camera Raw. They're horrible. They're full of red. You get a much, much, much more beautiful skin tone processing your files in Capture One. Much better. And it's just because of the engine. How many of you know that Capture One, I'm sorry, not Capture One, that Camera Raw has different flavors of Camera Raw? There's 6, 7 versions of Camera Raw that are inside. We're going to look at them today because one of my files is actually processed using an old version of Camera Raw. And they all give you slightly different flavors of your file. So anyway, something to be aware of. But nonetheless, so I'm starting with my device. I go through a profile into my ingestion software, and then this brings it ultimately into Photoshop. This is where the working space is. All Photoshop working spaces are identical for every version of Photoshop. So if I send one of my files that I got into this space, and I'm happy with the color here, and I send it to a retoucher in Hong Kong, they open it up. It's going to be exactly the same color in theirs because this mathematical space, this Adobe RGB, ProPhoto RGB, sRGB is identical on everybody's machine. This is not a device. There is no, when you put color into here, nothing is changed. It's independent of all of that. Does that make sense, everyone? This is really a critical part because this is the exchange place. This is where you, if you think about this being, this is like the universal translator. I'm bringing it in German and I want to send it out in English. So then, out of this working space, I need a monitor profile that is unique to my monitor. This takes that unambiguous color. The profile removes the device dependence that this monitor would introduce. And so what I end up with on my monitor is unambiguous color. And if there is a second monitor, it will have its own profile. And if I have a third monitor, it will have its own profile. But all of the monitors will appear identical because the individual profiles have removed the device dependence that the monitor introduces. Is this making sense? Who have I lost? Liam. Different levels of the software will do different things, but I'm showing you how to do everything. It's not going to be today, but I'm going to start with the camera part today. We were going to go through that whole process, and then probably next week we'll do monitor, and then later in the semester we'll do printers. But all of the gear to do all of this exists here at the college. Most people, the printer stuff especially, is extremely expensive. It's like you're in the $3,000 or $4,000 range for the hardware for that guy. Yeah. Anyway. And then finally, the same thing, if I go out to a printer, every printer has got its own unique profile, and that also is not just the printer, it also has to do with the paper that you use. So if you build a profile, say in printer A, and you're using an Epson Glossy, and then you decide you're going to throw in a Moab matte paper, that's a completely different profile. Even though it's the same printer, the response on that is going to be completely different because the surface of the paper is completely different and the ultimate resulting color is completely different. So you would do a profile for both of those papers on that printer and then use the respective one. Does that sort of make sense to everybody what's going on? Okay. Last thing I want to deal with before we jump in and actually do some work on this stuff. Color temperature, what is it? Yes, that's actually a good way of putting it. How warm or cool the color is? Is that what you said? Yeah, that's what I thought. So, but why do they call it temperature? Why don't they just call it color? I know. Yes. Yeah, that's sort of like you're moving in the right direction. It's a little bit more theoretical than that, so I'm going to talk to you guys about what it really is. So, there was a guy years ago called Fahrenheit, and he came up with the Fahrenheit scale, and everybody in the U.S. knows that, right? And there was another guy named Celsius, and he came up with the Celsius scale, and everybody outside of the U.S. uses that and knows that scale, right? So, but it's basically measuring ranges of temperature, right? So there's a guy who came along, his name is Kelvin, and he decides he wants to do a temperature scale. So I want to fucking do a temperature scale. I'm going to make mine the alphabet. No, anyway. Guy named Kelvin decides he's going to do it, but he's looking for something very specific. And so this is what he realizes. So if you think about molecules of water. So water is made up of little particles called molecules, and those are made up of little things called atoms. And they are just they're molecules of hydrogen and oxygen that simply move around and interact to it. Occasionally you imagine it's sort of like a soup, and they kind of like bang into each other, right? And if you add heat to them, they start to get more and more agitated. And they start to move faster, and they start to bang into each other harder. And that's eventually, if you keep doing this long enough, adding enough heat, whatever, what causes it causes steam. It actually causes them to bang into each other so hard and split so far apart that they go up and they evaporate into the air, and we lose that. If you go in the opposite direction, if you actually throw them in a freezer, those molecules, the energy, the motion in between them starts to dissipate and it starts to slow down. So in a freezer, we're removing heat. Heat is energy. And as we remove it, they get slower and slower and slower. And so what Kelvin figured out, or what he came up with, is he said, well, so what happens if you remove all the energy? There's a limit to that. You can't get any colder than removing all the energy. Once you take what they call, he referred to it as a theoretical black body, once you remove all its energy, there's nothing left. It is purely cold, it has no energy, and it is black. It is as black can get. Again, theoretical black body. If you take that theoretical black body, and he assigned 0 to that, so that is 0 degrees Kelvin. And I think, you can look this up, I think 0 degrees Kelvin is like 276 degrees Celsius below 0 on the Celsius scale. It's really cold, but it's not infinite. You can't go any colder because once you've eliminated all the energy, there ain't nothing left. There's no way to make it any colder. Absolute 0. So that's on the Kelvin scale, the black as you can get. If you then start adding energy to this, eventually what will happen is that it'll start to warm up enough and the body will start to actually glow. So at 2,000, 2,500 degrees Kelvin, that black body is now glowing a sort of an orangish color. As you continue to add more energy to it, more heat to it, again, the molecules start banging into each other hard or whatever, it tends to then move in the direction of blue. So by the time you get up to like 9,000 degrees Kelvin, you're actually into a serious cyanic blue sort of like range. The range down here in the 2,500, let's say right around 2,500, closer to 2,800, is the color of a typical old school tungsten light. So you go to mom and dad's house, they got the little tungsten light switch that they turn on. They haven't moved to LEDs yet. They haven't done the, daylight version of light bulbs, whatever. Typical old school tungsten light is about 2,800 degrees Kelvin. There are photobulbs, special photobulbs that are slightly bluer, and there's films designed just for that ran about 3,200 degrees Kelvin. If you go to the very top of Mount Everest on a completely cloudless day, you run into something that's around 9,000 degrees Kelvin. It's very, very, very blue. It's because it's really dominated by the blue sky. Even though you'll have sun, relatively speaking, the blue sky is actually causing a lot of that. If you take your Apple laptop computer right out of that cute little box, you just went to Apple, you just spent your $4,500. Yeah, you just spent your $4,500. You come home, you're all excited, you open it up, you pull all the packaging off, you fire that mother up. It's calibrated at a white point of 9,000 degrees Kelvin. It's really blue. Why? Makes all your pictures look more saturated. Makes all your pictures look sharper. It's not the real color of your pictures, it's a fake. By design. You cannot do color work, serious color work, on a monitor that's cast either blue or orange. You need to be neutral. So what you find on a Kelvin scale is that somewhere in the middle of all of this scale, the yellow-orange on this side is canceled out by the blue side, and you hit a perfectly neutral color right around 6,500 degrees Kelvin, which is the color temperature, the white point that you are going to use to calibrate your monitor to, and anything else that you work on. Are we good on this part? All right. So Verser, can we do something with this, please? We can. I'm going to close this guy up. I am not going to bother to save that guy. I need everyone to take a look really quickly back here. We're going to do this in a couple of steps. So everybody stand up, come right here, this crowd. Again, you won't hear this on You're looking at that print that's hanging on the wall. Again, and we are actually going to start working on files. Okay. So I need everybody, if they can, let's go ahead and start right back with the image that you already opened. But if you've got it open in Photoshop right now, close it up again really quickly. I want to open 2 files at the same time. So if you have the Girl in the Woods already open, go ahead and close that file up. Hold down your, go back to it again. It's in the folder. So this is in your session 2 files. In that folder, 2010 Woods 07, inside of there, there's 2 raw files in there. Just click on the top raw file, the frame 001, hold down your command key or control key on Windows and click on your frame 002, and then just command 0 to open them up. If you, let me know if it opens up in anything except for Camera Raw. If it opens up in Preview or starts to launch Capture One or, God forbid, Photos. Okay, so if it starts to launch Capture One, here, I'll just show you what you do, so follow me. Go back into your, back into the Finder where this file is. Only select one of them, and then do Command-I or up to the File menu down to Get Info. A dialog box will open up, and down at the very bottom, it will actually have Open With, and there will be a drop-down menu with a whole series of possible applications. You want to change yours from Capture One back to Photoshop. But then, you're not done yet. If you want that to be the case for all of your raw files, you click on Change All and then say OK to that, and it'll then automatically open in Photoshop. So once we get into Camera Raw, there's a couple of things that we need to set. So did everybody get these 2 files open in Camera Raw? Okay. A couple of things that I want to change really quickly in your preference setup. So if you click on look at the very top right-hand side of your screen, there's a little gear that sits up there. If you click on this little gear, it will actually open up to the Camera Raw preferences. I don't know if we set these last week, so we're going to set them right now. In terms of general, you can leave that at its default. In terms of its file handling, you can actually have your JPEGs and your TIFFs and your HEICs, which is an Apple JPEG. All of them can either open in Camera Raw when you launch one or not. That's all controlled by this file handling right here. I typically have mine do that, but if you don't want yours to do that, you don't have to have it do that. You can still force a JPEG to open up into Photoshop, but this would bring it into Camera Raw first. Anyway, it's just this drop-down menu right here. By default, everything will be disabled, so I'm just going to go ahead and show you what mine would actually look like. Under Performance, you don't need to change anything that's in here. Under Defaults, you do need to change one thing, and it is the raw defaults. Yours, by default, when Photoshop ships, it does not do any lens correction, and it doesn't do any chromatic aberration correction. We are going to look at what both of those are in just a minute, but I'm going to show you how to change yours. There is a drop-down menu under under your raw defaults. If you click on this drop-down menu and you come down to Choose Preset, so you'll come to Choose Preset, you'll get another fly-out menu, go all the way down to the bottom where it says Optics, and then come down to Lens plus CA Correction. So this is Lens Correction plus Chromatic Aberration Correction. You want this to be your default. You want to have the software understand what lens you're using and correct for distortion, also for vignetting, but then chromatic aberration. We will look at what chromatic aberration is in just a second. So is everybody good on this part? Then you want to say, in terms of workflow, the last thing we're going to change is at the bottom, I want you to change Open in Photoshop as Smart Objects. That will become your new default because that's the way we work in this class. And then also in your space, your color space destination, click on the drop-down menu. You want to pick Adobe RGB there, and then again, you can leave this as 8-bit. If for some reason you've always worked in ProPhoto and you want to stay in ProPhoto, you're welcome to stay in ProPhoto here, but you have got to change this bit depth to 16-bit, which will then double your file size and double the time it takes to do anything in Photoshop. I'm going to strongly suggest, because we are working in Smart Objects, that you keep it at Adobe RGB 8-bit and say OK to this. 16-bit doubles your file size, so it doubles your storage. If you've got a terabyte of storage right now, it takes 2. The problem with ProPhoto, it's many-fold, is that number one is that your monitor can't show you anything bigger than Adobe RGB anyway. So you can have all this color, but you can't see it. It gets even worse with ProPhoto RGB. It actually extends so far, it goes beyond the range of human vision. So you can push color out to the point you can't see it anymore just with your eyes. All problematic, but nonetheless. Anyway, yes?
On the defaults, there's like a section for like, it says raw defaults and then only like global settings.
Yes. No, it doesn't, and don't enable it. The thing is that you can set this up to work differently with different cameras. I don't know anybody who does it. It's an easy thing for them to implement. So it's a feature that I don't know that anybody uses, but it's there. But a lot of things will do that. I mean, Capture One, you can set it up to react differently to any camera you plug into, and it just reads the serial number off the camera and says, oh, this is the camera they're using, I'm gonna do this.
Does it really like does using different colors or saying you have to like does that really affect the color spaces?
It doesn't affect it has what it's really dealing with here on a more on a less esoteric level than that. What it's really dealing with primarily are things like lens distortions or sensor biases or that kind of stuff. So it's trying to deal with that, but we're going to get away from all of that because we're going to manually do it all. All right. So anyway, say OK to this. Then you'll notice that you've got two files. You've got one that's got this color card in it, and you'll have one that does not have the color card in it. If you click on that one, it's just a picture of the girl laying on the mirror. So this is the way we are going to work in this class. If you look at this color card that's sitting right here, come over to your basics panel that's on the right-hand side. At the very top, you've got your Instagram, you've got edit right underneath it, and all this is allowing you to do quick auto exposure and color control on your image. We don't care about that yet. You can convert it to black and white. You would never do that here. Or you can convert it to an HDR. We would also not do that here. We would do that completely different ways. In this drop down of profiles, though, this part matters. And this is where we actually need to build a custom profile for our cameras, because this is where you would actually load them. We haven't built one yet. That's going to be our next step. So I'm going to just follow up on the last parts of this, because a lot of people don't know how to actually apply settings that you're doing in one image to another image. So that's basically what we're going to do here. Finally, if you open up the color part right here, you will see at the very top after white balance, there's a little eyedropper. This is the color picker tool. And then I'm going to hold down, again, keyboard shortcut for this, spacebar plus the command key or spacebar plus control will give me temporarily the positive magnifying glass. If I add the option key to it, the negative. I'm going to grab that color picker, the white color picker eyedropper. And again, I have this problem all the time. Sometimes when I come over on my screen, I only get the magnifying glass instead of the eyedropper, but then I'll get the eyedropper. If you hover this over the red patch, that's sort of like, well, take a look at my screen, the red patch, you will see that there's a readout in your histogram that says 254 red, 85 green, and 85 blue. Now remember I said, the way things white balance stuff is that they're going to try to make all of those values even. So if you click on the red patch, you will actually see it does as good as it can possibly do. You'll see now that it's got a 91 green, a 92 blue, and a 135 red. It does not have enough room to actually make that correction. That correction is too demanding on this because I'm trying to make basically a red color a neutral gray. However, if I hover over the gray that's right underneath that, you will now notice that my RGB readouts in my histogram, whatever here, are just as wildly different. There's a 112 in the red, a 214 in the green, and a 255 in the blue. But if you click, what? Well, how different? like this. You don't have edit up here, you don't have profile up here, you don't have light up here, you don't have any of that. You start with color.
But mine's still 16.1.1. Here's it that.
The numbers don't need to be perfectly exact, they just need to be kind of close. But really the part of it that matters here to me, whatever, is that when I clicked on the patch that actually is a gray, look at my values right now. They should be the same or within 1 or 2 points of each other. So Barb, as long as you do that, if they get to be the same color, I don't really care what color it's reading out to you right now. We'll look at different versions of of Camera Raw in just a minute. Yeah.
You said the differentiation will only be like a few points, right?
Yeah.
Mine is like 20. And I just upgraded my camera roll last week.
Okay. Yeah, but you got a different color space that you're working in right here than me. So again, we're going to deal with all of these problems in just a second here. So, but nonetheless, does this make sense though, what we do here? So, and then if you actually hover over the little white patch, what do you see up here in my RGB readout? I'm getting a 244 for my red, a 243 for the green, and a 241 for the blue. What was my target for this white patch? 245 to 250, right? That's the white patch. Ironically, in Capture One, because it processes slightly differently, I actually get those values, and that's where I process all my files anyway. So they are legitimate, but this is still really, really, really close. So now I know I have perfect exposure and I have perfect color. And then you say to me, well, Versa, are you really telling me that you do every single thing that you do? You go out in the field with a laptop and this card and you shoot one of those pictures? Yes. Versa, are you climbing the back trunk of a car and you're tracking along to people running on the beach with a computer in there and you're actually tracking this the whole time with a digital tech in the trunk of the car with you? Yes. You guys think about all the people who used to haul that, you know, the pictures of the guys who used to shoot like in the, have I already said this to you, had this conversation with you? Yep, the guys out in the West with the cart and the whole, you know, the wet plate thing and all that kind of shit, and you think that you can't fucking carry a laptop around with you, you lazy ass people. I have. There is a reason for this. So even though they call this thing the white balance tool, you don't want to select on the white balance part, because what happens is that white, if you think about the curves in Photoshop, that white is really, really, really close to the upper right-hand corner. There's no room to really move the curve up there to do your color correction. You want the color correction part to be more down in the mid-range because you have bigger moves that you can do with it. And so you also don't want to put it down into the darker ranges because color casting happens up in the quarter tones and the highlights, not down in the 3/4 tone. You don't see color casting in the 3/4 tones and the shadows like you do in the quarter tones and the highlights. Better. So if when you hover over your image, does it stay as an eyedropper? Does it turn into like the magnifying glass? It's the hand. So go back up, click on the dropper again, and click on it again, and come back down. Sometimes you have to do it several times. Sometimes you have to actually quit Photoshop and come back into it. It's a bug that's been in Photoshop for years. Did you finally get to work? Okay. All right. All right. So the last part of all of this is that I don't want to work on an image that's got this card in it. I want to apply the changes that I've made to this other image, and that's the one I'm going to work on. Does that make sense, everyone? So to do that, if your thumbnails are on the side like mine are, that's great. If they're along the bottom, it doesn't matter. It works the same way. If you hover over the thumbnail that's actually got the card in it, you will see on the upper right-hand corner of the thumbnail, you get a little box with an arrow pointing down, and then an icon that's got 3 dots across it. That 3 dots across it is a drop-down menu. If you click on that, you can do a select all. This will select all of your thumbnails, and you'll see that the second thumbnail that's underneath it gets a smaller, fainter line border that goes around it. It's a little bit gray. It's not as white. The white is showing you the primary one that is in the viewfinder that you can see visible. The other one is just indicating that is actually been, that it is also selected. Then go back up to that very same space on the thumbnail, the 3 little dots, and click a second time and come down to Sync Settings. When you do that, a dialog box will open up and say, well, what do you want to sync? And in our case, you can leave this. There's some drop-down menus at the top. You could do all, because the only things that we have changed on this thing, is the white balance. We haven't changed anything else. So that's the only thing you really need. It'll be right here in the color group. You'll see there's a drop down in the color group. They're all selected. So as long as you've got that selected, you don't need to worry about it. These drop down menus are just other ways that you can actually say, oh, I only want to do this and not that, blah, 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 blah. Go ahead and say OK to this, and this will then apply all the color to the image that doesn't have the card to it. Click on the image that doesn't have the card to it, and then hold down the space bar and the command key and click on her shorts. I'm actually going to come in here even tighter, slightly tighter. So I'm going to zoom into 200%. And what in here is shadow detail? Or any place else in this image. Look up at her shirt. Look at her hair. Look at, what else can I look at? I could look at her boots. What's shadow detail in this? Oh, the boots actually might be a good one here. I'm going to take a look down in here. So yeah, I'm going to look at the boots. Look at the inner laces, sort of like the inner laces on this one inside one right here. I'm just going to hover over it, and what do I get in my RGB readout in my histogram? I've got a 27, a 25, a 25. Where did that number come from? Is it correct? What did we say just 10, 20 minutes ago? You cannot have forgotten already that this was in the mid-20s for my shadow detail. That is shadow detail. It doesn't look like it on this screen, but it sure looks like it on my monitor. Perfect exposure. If I needed to lift that for some reason, what I would do is come over to the little three dots. No, not the little three dots. Come over to the far right-hand side, to the toolbar that's on that side. Down near the very bottom is an eyedropper with a little icon next to it. If you click on that and then come over to your image and click again, it will actually throw down a color readout point for you called number 1. You can have up to, I think you can have up like 10 of these. So you can put them in different places. You can see that it's giving me this RGB readout for my number 1 here, and that is exactly where I want this thing to be for my shadow detail. However, go up to her pants again, and you'll notice that there's an area where her butt is touching that glass, and therefore it is a reflection of a shadow and a shadow. And when I hover over that, it says a 9 and a 4 and a 4, a 9 red, a 4 green, and a 4 blue. That would indicate that that's too dark to me, but there's no detail in here. I'm not trying to get shadow detail in this. There are things in your image that should be darker and have no detail in them. Just like there are things in your image that should be lighter and have no detail in them. Is this making sense, what we're talking about here? You guys have never been taught how to fucking process an image in Camera Raw, ever. I know you haven't. I know the people that you work with. How the fuck are you going to do your retouching and make your own work great and all that kind of stuff, whatever, if this is all a guess to most people. Oh, let's go ahead and hit auto. Actually, I hit auto all the time, but that's only so I can see what Photoshop thinks. Is this making sense to everyone, what's going on here? All right. One last thing I'm going to show you here really quickly. We're going to go ahead and click on this. Shoot.
So for the color file, like, which one do you recommend?
We're going to make our own in the next move, so hold on to that thought. I'm going to go ahead and click on Open Object. This is going to open this as a smart object. How many people in this room have no idea what a smart object is? Be honest. Thank you. We're going to get into smart objects today as well. All right. So this image is opened up as a smart object. If you take a look at your little thumbnail on the layers palette, you'll notice that there's a weird little icon that sits right down near the bottom of it. Yes? An arrow that said what? Oh, that's not the sound because are you going off your hard drive? Yeah, that's the problem. The problem is coming through the cable, but there's nothing you can do about that because it's this. It's not anything there. So you can copy this file onto your desktop and run it from there, and then it'll work. But you should be very suspicious of the cord first. Change the cord, but if this problem keeps happening, Do you have a backup of whatever's on that drive? Because you need one. Okay, so here's the advantage of this. So now if you look at the lower right-hand corner of this, you'll see there's a weird little icon on it. Again, if you're using the really small-ass little thumbnails that typically ship with Photoshop by the default, you can't see anything, so that won't matter. But if you double-click on this again, guess what? You go right back into Camera Raw. This is a copy of your raw data inside a Photoshop file, and you can keep it there forever. How many of you guys are working with raw data inside of your Photoshop files? Good, it's a must. Why on earth would you take that resource and pitch it? All right, you can close this up now. I'm gonna hit cancel here. I'm gonna close this up. Just double click on the thumbnail in the layers palette. It said what? Oh yeah, you're gonna get the same thing. But don't worry about it. This keeps looking for it. You said you wanted to use the event profile, so it's like, yeah, I know we already know this. Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's correct. That's actually nice. So what we close this is actually. Don't worry, we're going to go into the next one here. We'll see. Then we're going to actually develop another file using this whole system. So if this keeps happening, we'll figure it out. Okay, I'm going to cancel this. I'm going to close this. I'm not going to save this. Okay. In the software that I sent, in the class 2 files that I sent you guys, there are two inside the student files. There are two installers. One is for Macintosh and the other's for Windows. So if you take a look inside the folder, one of them says camera calibration setup.exe. Can you guys find that file? That is for the Windows people. Go ahead and double click that and run it and just say yes, 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 yes all the way through. Unless you've already done this. Have you guys already done this? Oh, okay. So in session 2, there's two files. One is called camera calibration setup. The other one is called color checker camera calibration. If you're on Windows, you want to run the camera calibration setup.exe. If you're on Mac, you want to run the color checker camera calibration.pkg. If you've already installed the software for the Color Checker Pro work, you don't need to install it again. But otherwise, you guys need to run this thing. So who is actually installing? Okay. You need to tell me when it's installed. I'm going to pause my guy really quickly. Yes. All right, so I'm going to launch mine. So application folder, because I'm on a Macintosh, it's going to be this. Color Checker Camera Calibration app. I'm going to double click on that. It's actually going to open it up. It's going to remind me that I haven't calibrated my monitor in a while. That's fine. I'm okay with that. So is everybody got this much, this far? Anybody not? Okay. We need to build a file to work in here. This works to build DNGs, but you'll see at the very top here, it'll say DNG, dual illuminate DNG, or ICC.TIFF. You can make ICC profiles in this software as well, which is what you need to use for if you want to do this very same work in Capture One. It does not, Capture One does not work with DNG profiles, but all of the camera raws do. So Lightroom, Photoshop, all the Adobe Suite is all DNG profiles, so that's what we're going to make today. So the next file that we're looking for, again, is in your week number 2. So retouching, class 2, students. And what you're looking for is there is a DNG custom profile example files folder. So inside your week number 2 DNG custom profile example files folder, if you open that up, inside you should have only one CR2. Do you guys have a CR2 and a DNG by any chance? All right, just the CR2. I'm going to throw my DNG away, so I'm the same as you. Double click on that CR2. It will actually open up in camera raw. And the only thing we need to do, so again, stop me if you don't get there. If I get ahead of you and you're not opening camera raw right now, let me know. Okay, if you take a look at the upper right-hand corner of your, inside your camera raw window, there is a little box with an arrow pointing down through the top. You need to click on that. This will actually allow you to save a DNG copy of this file, which is what we need to do. We need to make one of that. So again, the little square on the top right-hand corner that's got the arrow pointing down in it, click on that. It says what? This is a preference restart for you. Oh no, just grab this guy and drag it on top of it.
More noise, just like.
So we'll get to this later, but don't worry, we're going to get through other parts. Hopefully it will work on yours. Okay, so did everybody get this far? When this dialog opens up, basically what it's designed to do is save a version of your file. Your CR2 file is a DNG file. It's going to put it in this, if you don't make any changes here, it's going to put it in the same location. You could select a different place to put it, but we want it next to the one that we're doing. It's going to give it a DNG extension. Just hit save. You'll see a little lower left-hand side, there's a little blue bar that goes across to do progress. Once that's actually happened, you can simply hit cancel. Yes. Double-clicking on the file, the CR2 file. I'm in camera raw. I click on the box at the top that's got the arrow on it. I hit save. Then I hit cancel. And I go back to my Finder, right where that CR2 file was, and right next to it should be a copy. Has exactly the same name, just with a .dng at the end instead of a .cr2. Does everybody have that file? This is what you want to drag on top of that software you just loaded. So if you go to the software you just loaded, again, the color checker camera calibration software, if you grab that DNG and drag it on top of that window and let go, it will load it. If that's for some reason doesn't work for you, you can come up to your file menu and come down to load image, but in my case mine's already loading. And it actually, in my case, found the color checker and actually put a grid of little squares on top of it. Now, if yours doesn't find the color checker, again, that's this thing right here that I've already showed you guys. If it doesn't find the color checker, you can use the tools on the top right-hand side to actually locate it. So you can use the magnifying glass to zoom in and zoom out. If you grab the little arrow with the plus next to it, you'll see you can grab the corners of this grid and you can move them around. So you can move the entire grid. You just want to make sure that when you do this, that those little squares are perfectly inside, that they're not overlapping and hitting some of the black or anything else here. The auto does a very good job of finding these, but if it can't, you can place it there yourself. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, before we do anything else, go back to the Finder or back to your desktop, wherever you are in Windows. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be excluding the Windows people. Select the file that you've got. Don't double click on it. Just select one of them. It doesn't matter which one. If you hit the return key on Macintosh, it will actually select just the name. And you want to do a copy of this. So up to the edit menu, down to copy. We're just going to copy the name so that we can make a profile for the shooting that's actually named the same name as the shooting files are named. So I'm just going to do Command C. That's the shortcut to do a copy. And then I'm going to go back to this profiling software, and I'm going to say create profile down at the very bottom. So I'm going to click on bottom right hand side, create profile. It's going to say, okay, well, what do you want to call this thing? And I'm going to say, I do not want to call this EOS 5D Mark II, even though that was the camera that made it. I'm going to name this after my shooting, because not only is my camera critical to this, so is the lighting that I used for this. Yes. Yes. The thing is that this profile is unique to your camera, so you have to make one of these with the camera that you're using, and it will be only unique to that camera body. So if you've got, like, what do you shoot with? Sony? If you've got 2 Sonys, you have to make separate profiles for each one and tag them that way. So typically people will tag them with, if they're the exact same model, people use a serial number. But again, no, this profile will not work for anything but this one camera, and it's not this model, it's this camera body. Does that make sense, everyone? That's how specific you need to be with this stuff. So anyway, because I've actually got the name of my shooting on here, you would think that you would be able to just hit Command V to paste it, and it doesn't work. Nothing works in there. If you hit the delete key, you will get rid of the name. Then to get a drop-down menu in Macintosh, if you've got a right button mouse, you click on the right button and you will get a drop-down menu that will give you paste. If you don't have a right button mouse, you can hold down the control key and click, and you should get a drop-down menu. You do. And you can come down to do paste. Also, if you've got a trackpad for a Macintosh, you can do a 2-finger swipe down and get it. But anyway, you need to paste the name of the shooting in there. You'll see that when I did that, it also got rid of the extension. This is all problematic this is all on the camera calibration people software. This is stuff that they fucked up here. This is not working the way it normally should. But nonetheless, I'm going to get rid of the frame number. I don't need that, but then I'm going to put in a .dcp. Stands for D&G calibration profile, and not something on the end of that. So then, where is this going? This is going to be part of your assignment. You are going to make 4 of these this coming week. You need to then turn those profiles in as part of your assignment, so you need to go find them. This is where they are. It's in the assignments, so for the Windows people, simply look at the assignment. It'll show you where these profiles are stored. For the Macintosh people, you can just whip out your phone and shoot a picture of this, because that's where yours are. So I've just clicked on the drop-down menu underneath it on your screen. You should have the same thing that I'm seeing right here. So it's in the user library under application support inside Adobe Camera Raw Profiles. Camera profiles. Make sense? Are we good here? Okay, so for me, I'm going to call this number 99. I've got so many of these. I've done this so many times with this same file. I need to give it a weird number to make a distinction between it, but you guys will be fine with that 01. Are we good on this part? And then go ahead and hit save. I not only do one for every single camera I own, I do it for every lighting situation. So the camera profile itself, the sensor, will get you 95% of the way there. But if you really want the best you can possibly get, you do it for the lighting as well. So I'm out in the woods on this shooting. It's relatively bright in the morning. I do 2 or 3 shots under that same light. I don't need to build a new profile for that. But then it got to be really overcast in the afternoon, completely different color of light. So I made another profile for my afternoon. I go in the studio and I'll do one single setup and I will shoot that with no lighting changes. I'll keep one profile for 2 weeks. But I also go into the studio setting and I'll do 10 shots and every single one of them is individually lit. I will do a profile for every single one of them. What were you going to say, Patrick? Okay.
Wondering like which purpose of all
What?
purpose of this app color detector.
We're going to use it right now. So we're going to go ahead and say, so it says it was successfully created. Go ahead and say okay, and then you can quit this software. Done everything it needs to do. Everybody good on that part? All right. So at this stage of the game, we are going to launch that same RAW file, that CR2 file again. So just double click on it, go back into Camera Raw. But now we're going to use this thing to actually give us unambiguous color. That whole process we just went through was to develop a profile to remove the device dependence of our sensor. Make sense? So to do that, you need to find, if you open up in the basics panel, open up the color panel. Actually, I take that back, open up, hang on. Oh, the profile one at the very top. This has gotten to be so important for Photoshop and for Lightroom people, whatever. This profile used to be buried down in, it was buried down in the panel that actually allowed you to do calibration. They've now moved it up. It is like the #1 thing you do. This is before you do any color work or light or any of that kind of work. So up in the top where it says right now, mine says camera standard. You will notice that there's a little icon to the right of that looks like 4 little squares with a magnifying glass. This is the browser. I prefer to go here. You can use the drop-down menu, but I prefer to use the browser. So I'm going to click on the browser. It will open up this thing of thumbnails, and what you need to do is the ones that are at the very top, there's a lot of canned profiles in here. There's the Adobe Standard, there's an Adobe Portrait, an Adobe Neutral. All of these have been developed by Adobe, actually using this very same process. What you're looking for is the folder in here that just says Profiles. If you click that open, you will actually see all these profiles that are underneath the little thumbnails. You probably should only have one in there. Do not select it. This is what I want you to do first instead. Just hover over it. Don't select it, hover over it, and then take your cursor off, and then back on, and then back off. Look what's happening to your image. Do you think that's a subtle change? No, this is massive, and there is no way in hell you would know how to do this or why to do this or correct for this. If you zoom in to the color card and hover over it again, look specifically what happens to the blues. So especially the blue patch that's down in the lower left-hand side, it gets way darker and way more saturated when I use the correct profile. What that's telling me is that my sensor in this camera body is too sensitive to blue light. So it's overreading the blue, and it's making all of my blues considerably brighter than they actually should be. But look at what happens to that sweater. Are you fucking kidding me? How do you know to make that correction? You would never know that. So then you simply click on that profile, which will now be the profile that you want for this. And then you do your color balancing. So I'm going to zip back out to do your color balancing, because we haven't done that part yet. At the very top underneath the histogram, there's a little word that says a back with an arrow next to it. This will actually take you back to the basic panel. And then we can go to color and click on the white balance. Again, what we've done is remove the sensor bias, but we haven't white balanced this image. We've just removed the sensor bias. You still need to white balance it, and you still need to check the exposure and everything else. So I'm clicking on the white balance eyedropper. I'm zooming into the color card so I can get to the patch, to the gray patch that's right next to the red. That's the one I typically go for. And click on that. This is now, and hover over the white and see what my readout is, and it's still at that 245 to 250. Perfect exposure, perfect color, because now you've removed the bias of your sensor. Is this making sense to everybody what's going on? Okay, before we do anything else in here, because this part is now correct, these are the files that you are going to need to turn into me. So go back to your Finder before, we're not even going to get out of here yet. Go back to your Finder. That DNG that you made originally is a baked DNG. We need to make another one that has the correct profiles in it. Because if you don't use the profile for if you don't use a DNG as your base, when you make these profiles, right now you've got the color correction profile is sitting in your computer. But if you take an image that you, and you go ahead and you process your, you process your image and everything's great, whatever, but then you put that on our external hard drive and then you bring it, or you send it to me for me to grade. When I open that thing up, it's not going to have that profile in it because that profile is sitting in your computer. So we need to embed that in something that will actually hang on to it, and DNGs will hang on to it. But the first DNG that we made is already baked. So even if I load this thing in there right now, it will not stick in here. So throw this DNG away. Go back to your camera raw. Everything is good now. I've got the correct profile. I am white balanced. Then make another DNG of this with these corrections made. So again, I'm not editing an existing DNG. I'm creating a brand new one. Click on the arrow that's in the little box. Hit save. And you will be good to go. This is the DNG you'll turn in that has the profile in it as well as the white balance. Again, when you read through the assignments, it's very explicit about this. It'll walk you through most of this. The video will be here for you to refresh, and you can always email me. Are there questions about this part? I'm sorry? No, you don't. You're going to do this. I'm giving you all the files. These are all these. You get all the files for this class, everything except for the final project. So the assignment's going, there's all the files are in here. All of them have color cards, the whole 9 yards. You'll be good to go. Oh. You ultimately want to definitely do this for your camera because you don't ever, did you see how much that jumped? That's nuts. That's alarming. Wait till you see what happens with monitors. We'll get to that next week. Okay, we've got, yes. No, what I'm doing is because I'm hooked up, so I'm shooting tethered in the field, and I'm under a cloth looking to try to set that white patch at the correct exposure, because it's not something you want to do in software. If you're actually underexposed to stop and you bump it to stop in software, that's not really the same as actually having the data that you've exposed for. So that's how I do it. But that's why I said I don't ever shoot without a laptop. Yes. You can. You can get them from the cage downstairs, and you can also get them at the studio. So when you opened up that thing, you remember it said DNG and then it said dual illuminant. So what the dual illuminant is about, it's what you would ideally do is you would want to have one profile that was in daylight and one that was in any of your other lights. I use the same cameras. I've got hundreds of profiles for one camera, because I do it for every lighting situation. But if you want a more generalized profile that's not that specific, you can actually take an image that was shot in tungsten and one that was shot in daylight, tell that software you want to do dual illuminant, and it will load both of those, and it will give you an average profile. But again, for me, and that average profile is great. It gets you 95% of the way there. But if you want that extra, you got to do it per shooting, really. Yes? They'll tell you 2 or 3 years, but if you're really good to them, keep them closed, not ever in daylight, never let them sit out, don't touch, when people open them up, don't touch them with your hands because you get grease on it, that kind of stuff. But I think they say it's like 2 or 3 years. But again, these people are looking to make money. So, this is like the dentist. This is like going to the dentist. Didn't you wish you had a job where you could tell the people who are paying you all the money that they're paying you, you have to come back and do this again in 6 months? Or things are really awful here. You need to come back every 3 months. Anyway. All right, questions about this. Are we good? All right, smart objects. What is a smart object? So for those of you who know, great. Most of you who know, think you know, don't really know. So here, I've got an image. It's an image like this. I open this up in Photoshop and I do a transform to it. That is a destructive move. However, if I make a smart object out of this, the way you need to think about a smart object is that a smart object, you need to think of it as an envelope, a protective envelope. So if I can take this image and I can put it inside my protective envelope, I can transform this in here and it is not destructive. So we're going to see how that works right now, and then we're going to leverage this. And we've got to zoom through this pretty quickly, so here we go. You can go into Photoshop right now. This is actually still in camera raw. I'm going to close that. I'm just going to cancel that and close that part up. I am going to open up our retouching session 2 again. No, I'm not going to do session 2. Go to session 1 and open up the red car. So in session 1, the red car, the Corvette that we were color changing last week, if you can just open that up really quickly. Once you get it open, again, if you double click on the hand, it will make it as large as it can be without hiding anything but showing you the whole car. Everybody got it open? Max, is this working for you? Okay, good. Hit Command J. That actually makes a copy of your layer. So with Command J actually done, we are going to do a transform on this. So the shortcut for transform is Command T. If you can't remember that, go up to the Edit menu, down to Free Transform, down to Transform, and just pick the Free Transform. You will get bars that come up in the corners and in the mid parts that allow you to do a transform. But what you need to do, and this is going to be true for everything in this class, is the minute we do any tool or anything, change of any tool, Command T, the options bar up at the very top changes to give you options for whatever you're doing. So we've now got an option bar at the top that's going to allow us to transform. However, the way it's set up right now, you can transform the width without transforming the height, which in some cases would be fine, but it'll distort your image. We want to keep the ratio the same. So if you look up at the very top, right between the width, which is W at the 100% stands for width, the H for heights is also at 100%. There's a light between the two. There's a little icon that is a lock. If you click on that lock, it will then actually put those ratios together, and therefore when you change one, it will change the other one correspondingly, and your image will look fine. Make sense? So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to crush it. I'm going to make this 5%. So I just selected my 5%, and I'm just going to hit 5 point, or in my case, this is taking it to 50%. So I need to scratch over that 0, and I'm going to do 5.0. And it should change the other one. I changed the height, mine changed the width one, did change as well. Go ahead and hit the check mark to actually do that, and you will see that you now have a very little car. If you turn off the eyeball of the bottom layer in your layers palette, you'll see that you got a little bitty ass car there. So you're not dealing with width and height. If we go back, layer copy, Command T, click on the link between width and height, you're changing angle here, or width and height. And you have the lock on in between width and height. So is height changing as well, or width? You can also hover over either the H or the W. You'll get the scrubby slider, which is a hand that's got fingers going right and left, and you can click and drag till it goes down to 5%. Do you get it to work? Okay. So if we turn off the background layer, you'll see you got a small ass little car. So still with this top layer selected and active, we're not going to do an undo. We are going to retransform it to open it back up again to its original size. So Command T, click on the link between width and height, and then you're going to type in 2000. And the reason we're doing 2000 is that this image, we crushed it by 20 times when we went from 100% to 5. Now we need to blow it back up 20 times. So 100 times 20 is 2000. So this will bring it up roughly to this image, and go ahead and click on the check mark. We call that destructive. Look at turn on the eyeball for the one underneath, and then turn these two off. That is a destructive move. You cannot recover from that. And what happens in Photoshop, so much of the compositing work that we're doing, especially when we're trying to scale imagery to fit, is that you're transforming up and down and up and down and up and down, and every single time you do that, that is a destructive move. We don't want to do that. We want to do this non-destructively, and that's where smart objects come in. Again, what we did before, what we just did was we had an image like this. We crushed it down, we brought it back up. Because this wasn't anything special, that wasn't protected, it crushed it down, it threw away all that pixel information, and then when we blew it back up, this is what we get. That's the result. Instead, now we're going to actually create a smart object. So the smart object will put it into this envelope. Protect it, and we're going to do the same thing, and you'll see what happens. So go back up to your history palette, which is on your left-hand side here, and click on where it said layer via copy. That will go us back in time before we've done any of the transforms. You'll still have 2 layers. Make sure that that layer 1 on the top is selected, and then we're going to convert this to a smart object. So up to the layer menu, down to smart objects, convert to smart object. You can also do this if you go all the way to the far right side of your layers palette and hold down the control key, or if you have a right mouse, you can click and get a drop down menu, and you can also get in the flyout menu that goes down there, convert to smart object. You also, I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that, can go up to the filter menu and come down to convert for smart filters. This is the exact same thing. It's a smart object conversion, although this will get rid of the, you don't have to see that dialog. Everybody got a smart object? You will know it's a smart object because there's this weird little icon in the lower right-hand corner of that layer alone. Command T brings up the transform dialog box. Click on the link between width and height. Use the scrubby slider to drop your height down to 5%. Your width will be the same thing. Click on the check mark up in the options palette to go ahead and apply this. Turn off the background layer eyeball, and you'll see you've got the same small ass little car. Make sure that you're still on that layer number 1. Command T, but look what has changed. Unlike when we did it destructively and our transform dialog box went back to 100%, this actually remembers that we've done this transform down to 5%. So it remembers all of those figures. So then you simply need to click on the link between width and height, grab the scrubby slider and drag it back up to 100%. Click on the check mark and say OK. Non-destructive transforming. It gets better. This is now a smart object. Come up to the filter menu. Why do I get the feeling I'm doing this alone? Up to the filter menu, down to blur and Gaussian blur, and I want you to put a serious ass blur on this. Let's do like 35 pixels. Sure. Pretty serious blur. And say OK. This is now a smart filter. Again, you cannot fuck up this smart object. Non-destructive. This is protection. So instead of a typical filtering like you guys are normal with, used to work with, whatever, that is a destructive move, this is created as a smart filter. If you look down underneath your layer, you'll see that there's a Gaussian blur down here. You can double click on that Gaussian blur, and the value that we put in is just still there. And this will, you can save this file, open it up in 15 years, and it will still be there. You could change this. I'm going to make mine worse. I'm going to crank it up to 75 now, or 76, and say OK. But look what else you've got on this. You have a mask for your filter. How many people in here have ever painted with a filter? Well, we're going to do it right now. Click on the layer, on the filter mask, the smart filter mask. You'll know it's selected because there's a white border around it. And we need to invert this. We need to make it black. We need to hide the filter effect. Command I will actually invert it because we've now got a black mask on the filter. It's actually hiding all the blurring. But now if I hit the B key to get a brush, I'm coming over to my image. I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger. To make my brushes larger and smaller, I use the bracket keys that are just to the right of the P key. The opening bracket makes your brush smaller. The closing bracket makes it larger. white is my foreground color. If white is not your foreground color, hit the letter D to default your foreground and background colors to black and white. Then use the X key to make sure that white is your foreground color. And then with the little framework around the Smart Filter mask, that tells you you're painting on that mask, come in and you can paint the blur of the car back in. Are we good on this part? Close this guy up and we're going to get to one last one. You do not need to save that. Okay. Last thing, we got roughly a half hour to get through this. We can do this. I know you guys are going to be with me. Okay, class number 2, in your student files. This is actually part of your homework. So if you do this with me in class and turn this file in, you're going to get 100 for this part of your assignments. So not only are we pushing it a little bit, I've made you guys stay a little bit, I've hit you pretty hard today, I'm sorry about that, but anyway, we're going to do one of your assignments right now, and then you'll be able to turn that in. So you're going to get ahead of the game, right? Oh, Versa, we love you for that. Yes, thank you so much. Okay, so the file that you're looking to open in that in your session number 2 is Bruce Fraser Copyright 2005 D&G. If you can double click on that, should launch into Photoshop. And it's a picture of a castle. I don't know, I think it's Scotland, but I can't swear to that. It's not my picture. It's a guy named Bruce Fraser who's a Photoshop guru guy. And so this is actually a working file from one of his books. Nonetheless, I know when I open mine up, because this is a D&G, it's actually held on to information of how I last processed this, and I don't want that to happen. I want all of us to start on the same page at the same part. So to do that, if you look at the far right-hand side of your Camera Raw, the little 3 dots that are sort of like about almost mid-screen down on the far right-hand side, click on those little 3 dots and come down to Reset to Default. And this will be then what your image looks like. It's a very kind of, I mean, it's sort of okay, exposed, whatever, but a little bit washed out. Has everybody sort of got something that looks like this? Okay. Remember I said that we could actually work in different versions of Camera Raw, different processes of Camera Raw. I'm going to show you how you find that. This when I processed this originally, we were on a different version of Camera Raw. Camera Raw, they release a new version of this every couple of years now. We're up to 7 versions of it, I think, now. That doesn't mean that everything that they did got better, but most importantly, if you processed a file years ago using one version of Camera Raw, and let's say you had to do another copy of that very same shooting, you would want those two to be the same. You don't want to try to figure out different processing. So anyway, that's where we're going to change this. So if you come down to the very bottom of your stack of on the control, flyout palettes that are on the right side, all the way down at the very bottom is calibration. If you click that and open it up, you will see under that there is a thing that says process. And if you click on that drop down menu, you will see they used to date these. They don't date them anymore. Version 6, this is the most recent version of Camera Raw. It doesn't matter. What I need you guys to change yours to is version 2. And when you change this to version 2, your entire panels are going to change. So if we come back up to the very top right now and you open up light, you will actually notice that this is no longer where we were before. We've now got exposure, we've got recovery, fill light, blacks, brightness, contrast. We've got a completely different vibe. This is what Photoshop looked like in 2010. So this processing is now 14 years old. But it's the values that I have, and I'm going to give you the values to plug in. The values that I'm going to tell you are specific to this image. I've had people there's a homework assignment that's going to ask you to do the same thing, and I've had people use the exact same numbers that I'm going to give you right now for the homework assignment, and it means nothing. They're totally unrelated. This is just how I would process this image. So, how do you guys dodge and burn in this class? How do you dodge and burn? How do you open up an image and dodge and burn? Make shit lighter, make shit darker. Most of you will put a curve on that makes it lighter and use a mask. Some of you will put a curve on that makes it darker, use a mask. Some of you guys will use a soft light layer. Am I missing anything? You're all wasting your time. You're all throwing away the power and the strength of using Camera Raw. So that's how we're going to leverage this stuff. We're going to do things that you could not, that would be impossible for you to do inside of Photoshop, that you can do in Camera Raw. So it's going to go a little bit quick, but follow this one with me. I'm going to give you the numbers to read out, so I want you to type in the numbers. These won't matter if you haven't changed your calibration process to version 2. So with version 2 selected, I'm also going to open up color. So in color, we're going to start here. I want you to drag across the color temperature for color. Actually, that's really weird that they've done this like this. Yeah. Old school, they used to revert the entire thing to be the way it was actually laid out. Now they're not doing it that way. So we've got to change a couple things in here. So for color, drag across the color temperature. And again, I'm going to give you the values to put in. So for color temperature, you want to put in 6800, 6800. Hit the tab key. It will take you down to tint. For tint, you can leave this at a +7. Hit the tab key and go down to vibrance. Put in 35. Hit the tab key to go down to saturation and leave that at 0. So 6800 for the temperature, +7 for the tint, +35 for the vibrance, 0 for the saturation. Everybody good on that? Then open up the light panel. For your exposure, you want to do a -0.95, basically a -1 stop. If you don't need to get the 9.5 exactly. If you get a 9.6 or whatever, it doesn't. And again, it's a 0.95, not a -95. So basically about a full stop underexposed. Hit the tab key to go to recovery. For recovery, you can leave it 0. Hit the tab key to go to fill. Fill is also 0. You can leave it. Hit the tab key to go to blacks. Change that to 18. Hit the tab key for brightness, 81. Hit the tab key for contrast, 56. And then finally for effects, clarity needs to be changed to 52. And then say open as object. If your thing doesn't say open object down here, you can hold down your shift key and it'll change from open to open object. But we set up the preferences to change that so that it was always open object. If for some reason when it says open object, you only want to open it as a non-smart object, you hold down the shift key and it'll allow you to just open the file. But I want to open this as a smart object. So go ahead and click on open object and say okay. I'm going to double click on the hand again to get this as big as I can get it. So this was made for the base of all of this. You can tell that this is a smart object. If you double click on the layer right now, the thumbnail, you will go right back into Camera Raw with these settings all still here. This is a copy of your raw data and it will stay inside of Photoshop and you can reprocess it over and over and over again. Does that make sense to everyone? Are we good on this part? Okay, I'm gonna hit cancel here because I'm not making any changes right now. I'm gonna make a copy of this layer because I want to reprocess this file again for the sky. So Command J makes a copy of it. However, I'm going to strictly double click on this really fast. I'm not gonna put in, so I've double clicked now on my second layer. And I'm just gonna drag I'm gonna open up my light and I'm just gonna drag this down to a -4 stops. And say okay. I double clicked on the top layer, just said -4 stops, and then brought it open. What I want you to look at is this, because it's a mistake, it's a problem. When you do copies like we typically do copies of before with smart objects, it makes just a second reference to the one smart object. In this file, there's one smart object with 2 references to it. Both of these layers are referencing the same image that is inside this envelope. The castle's inside this envelope. Layer number 1 references this envelope. Layer number 2 is referencing the same envelope. So when I made that change, it fucks them both up. I don't want that. So hit Command Z on your computer to undo that. Throw away this layer that's at the top. If there's nothing else you remember from this exercise, what we do next is going to be it. Because this is what I need to do is I need to make a second copy of my raw data and then reprocess that, not a second reference to one smart object. I now need two smart objects that have two separate copies of my raw data in it. Make sense? So to do that, the only way to do this, you can't click on copy down here, you can't drag this down and make a copy. The only way to do it is to come up to the layer menu, down to smart objects, over to new smart object via copy. Everybody take out your phone and humor yourself and shoot a picture of this screen, because this is what you need to remember. Because if you don't do this, you're going to end up just making clone after clone after clone of your one smart object, and that will not help you at all. So up to the layer menu, down to smart objects, new smart object via copy, then double click on that one, on again the second layer, and I'm going to give you a whole new set of values. Open up your color, make sure that the color temperature, go ahead and select color temperature. It was 6800. You're going to change this now to 4700, 4700. Hit the tab key. You can stay with the 7% on the tint. Hit the tab key coming down to clarity, to vibrance, and change that to 0. And the tab key saturation is also at 0. Then go to the light panel, click on that drop down. We are going to change the exposure to a -1.5 stops, so much darker. So -1.5. The recovery we're going to take up to 96. Again, if you hit the tab keys between this, it'll actually do it for you. So recovery is 96. Tab key, fill is going to be 0. Tab key, the blacks is going to be 32. Tab key, the brightness will be 60. Tab key, the contrast 6. Tab key, that gets me through all of that. Then go down to effects. And in effects, you're going to take clarity all the way up to 100%. Are we good on this part? And then say, okay. And now what you'll notice is that if you turn off the top layer, you've actually got one layer. The top layer I processed for the clouds. The bottom layer has actually been processed for the grass. I'm going to just put these two together. If we have a chance, I'm going to do a third one for the castle. Is everybody good about where we're heading for all of this? Okay, so the trick to this is that I want to make a layer mask that actually only shows me the sky. That's what I want to do. So I'm going to do the quick down and dirty version of this. There's a million ways to actually make this selection, but for today, I'm going to make it as quick as I can. I'm going to use the quick selection tool. So if you come over to your tool palette, you come down, it's the fourth tool down, you will see you'll get a flyout menu and you'll have either object selection, quick selection, or magic wand. I want you to select the quick selection tool and then bring it over onto your screen. Again, this is a brush. Mine's extremely small, so I'm going to use the bracket keys just to the right of the P key. The one just to the right is a smaller brush. The one to the right of that is a larger brush, and I'm going to make mine a little bit larger. If you're the kind of person that uses drop-down display using modifier keys, go ahead and use that. Anyway, you need a brush that's about the size of a quarter. But you also need to know how the quick selection tool works. Most of you have some idea, but not really. So this is the way the tool works. What it will do is it will recognize what you're painting on. But what it'll do is it's going to actually search for an edge that's away from what you're doing. So I'm looking for it to get the edge of the horizon where the grass is actually meeting the sky and where the castle meets the sky. But here's the problem. If you let your brush touch that edge, it no longer will be looking for that edge. It will be looking for a new edge that's further into your image, not the one that you're hoping for it to find. So you never let the brush touch the edge you want it to find. You also need to help Photoshop out, and there's a quick way we can help Photoshop out do this. It's looking for edges, so it's looking for contrast. Look at this image right now. Is there a huge amount of contrast between the sky and the grass? It's not bad, right? But turn off the eyeball of your upper layer. Isn't that better? much higher contrast between this copy of my image than the one that I was looking at. This has now got a sky that's almost white and a perfectly defined edge on the background, right? So I'm going to use this to build my mask. So you start out at the very top, you click and just start to drag across the sky. Again, stay away from the edge. And by the time you pretty much get over with any sort of quickness at all, it's going to select everything else for you. So it's made a selection of this edge. We are not going to refine this edge today. We will do that next week. This makes a pretty good mask for it, but we'll do it next week so you can see. Turn on your eyeball for your sky layer. Click on your sky layer to make it the active layer. And then down at the bottom of your layers palette, there is an icon that's a square, a light square with a little black circle in the middle or dark circle in the middle. That is the add layer mask. Simply click on yours, and we've now combined these two images. Now, admit to yourself, you could never dodge and burn like this using a curve or a soft light layer in Photoshop. It simply wouldn't happen. This is your homework. You need to save this right now as your homework, so save it to a desktop something. We're going to try one more because we've got 10 minutes to do this. So we're going to gild the lily now. We're actually going to go after one more, and we're going to reprocess this file again for just the castle. Is everybody good on this part so far? Did everybody get this far? All right, we're in good shape here. Okay, say what? Yeah, so when you do your save as, do all the stuff that you turn in here is either a PSD or a TIFF. Don't give me JPEGs. If you get a giant file over 2 gigabytes, it'll have to be a PSB file, but that's still a Photoshop file. It's just a really big ass one. Okay, I'm going to come back down to my original layer because I'm going to put the castle between the sky and the background. Now, there's no reason that you have to do that, but the way, once you start getting to really complex compositing, what you'll find is that you want to keep some sort of sense. For me, I typically do foreground to background as bottom of my layer stack up to the top. Especially when you start to build shadows and that kind of stuff, this is going to matter. So anyway, I'm going to put my castle layer between these two. So to do that, I'm going to click on my first layer, my background layer. Again, you cannot Command J this. You need to make yet again another copy of your raw data up to the layer menu, down to Smart Objects, down to New Smart Object via Copy. You can also name your layers right now. So I'm going to name my bottom layer. I'm going to just click on that name, the Bruce Fraser part, and I'm going to call it Grass. I'm going to double click on the middle one, and I'm going to call that Castle. And I'm going to double click on the top one, Name, and call it Sky. This doesn't really matter so much at a 3-level thing like this, but once you get into 50 levels, 100 levels, 1,000 levels, whatever, naming matters. So with the castle actually now active, I'm going to double click on it. This will then take me into Camera Raw. It still has the raw settings that I applied using the original base layer for this. So we're going to go back to color. We're going to start with color. It does have 6800. That's where I want to leave my color temperature. Tab key down to the tint. You can still leave that at 7. For vibrance, you want to 0 that out. And then go up to your light panel. Double click on that -9.5, and that's actually going to change to -1.5 as well. Tab key. For the recovery, 52. Tab key for the fill, 27. Tab key for the blacks, 16. Tab key for the brightness, 91. For the tab key contrast, 68. Sorry, something went wrong on mine. 16 was fine. For my brightness, I wanted 91. Tab key contrast is 68. And we should be, check on the effects and do clarity all the way up to 100%. So do you guys need me to go over that again, or are you good? Okay, so for the clarity on the effects, it's all the way up to 100. For color, the The color temperature was 6800. The tint was 7. Vibrance and saturation were both at 0. Then for the light values, your overall exposure is a minus 1.5 stops. The recovery was 52. The fill light was 27. The blacks were 16. Say what? 16. The brightness is 91. And the contrast was 68. And go ahead and say okay to that. So now for this image, this was built just for the castle. So I need to select just the castle. Again, I'm seeing the sky, the darker sky that we've already put into here. I don't want that on when I'm trying to make the selection, because if I turn it off, I get much more contrast. I have a much more delineated edge on the very top. Make sure that you do have the castle layer selected though, the one that's in the very middle. We're still going to work with the quick selection tool. However, my quick selection tool now is way too big, because remember, I wanted to find the edges of the castle. Well, and I said, but you cannot touch the edges of the castle. So you got to make your brush considerably smaller. I'm also going to zoom in. Again, for me, the shortcut to zoom in is strictly the space bar and the command key. If you hold them down at the same time, you get the magnifying glass. I'm going to start even smaller with my brush to make sure I don't hit the hedges. And I'm going to click. If you do get part of the hedges, don't worry about it. Go ahead and finish the rest of the selection of your castle. Take a look at my screen right here. I got all of the castle, but I got a lot of the hedge stuff as well. So then you hold down the Option key and you will get a little minus symbol in your quick selection tool. And then you can start dragging over the edge of the hedges where it hits. But remember, you do not want to touch the edge of where the hedge touches the castle. Otherwise, it will start to look for stuff in the castle. And this has actually refined my edge well enough to give me a selection of this. How many people in this room save their selections? That changes today. No, save the selection. I need to save this so I can go back to this. To save your selection, go up to the Select menu and come down to Save Selection, and we can call this Castle. And say OK to that. Then I'm going to actually use that, apply that as a layer mask. So I'm going to click on the layer mask icon, again, the square with the circle in the bottom at the very bottom. This is now actually masked out the castle, and then finally I'm going to turn on the sky. So now I've got one image that I processed for the sky, or one layer that I processed for the sky, one layer that I processed for the castle, and one that I did for all the grounds underneath it. This is impossible to do with a baked file. What do I mean by a baked file? That is a file that you bring into Camera Raw, you make all your adjustments in Camera Raw, and then you simply bring it into Photoshop as a regular pixel image, and you save it as, that is not raw data. Look at how many times we've reprocessed this. Go back to your very first one, go back to the grass base, double click on it. This is a copy of your raw data processed with these settings. Hit cancel. Double click on the castle one. Oh, come on. Second copy, come on. Second copy of your raw file with a completely separate set of processings. Finally, double click on the sky one. Third set of your raw data processed completely differently. How the hell do you do that?
Prof, just one question. Imagine save selection and stuff.
Imagine what?
Or save selection while you were like selecting the castle.
Right.
Instead to save.
So when I did that, I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of here. When I did that, so the question was, oh, I saved the selection, right? You can throw away the layer mask for the castle. So just grab it and throw it down to the trash. It's gone. I can then, if I want to load this again, if I want to redo that part, I can simply come over to my channels palette. I can load it here, or I can go up to the select menu and I can come down to do load selection. And in the drop-down menu, just say castle, load it. It's loaded, and then I just add it as layer mask. And the more complex your selections get, the more you want to save them. Questions about this? So you need to save this file and turn it in just like this, and you'll get 100 on this part. Yes. Don't worry about the naming part. Nobody has turned in any assignments yet. We will do that together as a class first thing next week. So just do the file work, save it, whatever you want to save it. Just put it in a place where you know where you can find it easily, and we will go through the whole naming convention next week. Is that fair? Oh yeah. So yeah. No. Yes. No. It's a great question. It's a great question. So up to the file menu to save this, come down to Save As is how I would do this. A dialog box will open up, and in the drop-down box here, again, you can just leave it at this name right here, or just call it Assignment 1. Or again, we're going to change the naming before you turn it in next week. I'm going to put mine in my TOS volume, but in the drop-down menu for format, you should only see 4 of them. You should have TIFF, Photoshop PDF, Photoshop file, or a large format document. You don't need the large format document until your file gets over 2 gigabytes, so you would do this either as a Photoshop file or a TIFF file. If you do it as a Photoshop file, you'll simply say save. I do not save my stuff to the cloud. I save it to my computer, so I do not click on Save to Cloud Documents. I would do save, and that'll take it to your desktop. If you do save as a TIFF, you will actually, once you hit save, it will come up with options to do compression here. Do not do any compression on this. Just simply hit OK. And either file, either Photoshop or TIFF, are fine to set in because it will keep all of the layers, it'll keep the masks, it'll keep everything you do. They understand each other. Any questions about this?
I have a question.
Shoot.
I remember, like, you always recommend us to not compress the file while we zip.
Yes.
But why? It half the size and it doesn't lose much.
Yeah, but it doesn't lose much. It's like a little bit pregnant. Yeah, don't worry about that part. No, you'll actually get that in the thumbnail. It'll be the thumbnail. It's just the thumbnails don't understand layers. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, we can take a quick look at it, but yes, if you go to our Canvas site, so if you go to our Canvas site, session 2, these are the assignments. So 2.1 is to create a custom D&G profile for each Capstone session in the assignment folder. Assignment 2.2, apply the D&G profile and color balance your raw files. Assignment 3, parametrically dodge and burn this file here is one of my fashion files. And then parametrically dodge and burn the Bruce Fraser file. This is the one you've just done. So you did 1 out of 4 assignments. Just what we just did. It's not dodging and burning using curves and shit. It's reprocessing your file over and over. That's where the parametric part comes in. Are we good on this? Are there questions about any of this? Okay. Max, are you going to stay for a second if you want to try and troubleshoot that stuff? Okay.
So when are we going to start using this?
Probably next week. So bring your Wacom tablets next week.